Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot, and welcome to our famous Flyer 10, the Boeing 707 tutorial. In today's tutorial we are going to go over a complete flight from A to B, from cold and dark to the arrival at the stand. We will not be using the artificial flight engineer for all of our setup flows, but we will be using him for some of the in-flight monitoring. That way you can learn how to operate the entire aircraft during your normal operations, and you can focus on flying the airplane like you would in the real world when you're in flight. Alright, let's go ahead and start this one with a general bit of a setup. So for today's flight we are flying from the brand new Delhi scenery down to Mumbai on the Air India Boeing 707. Let's have a very quick look into our flight plan before we start with the general setup of the aircraft and a couple of prerequisites that you should have a look at. So this is what today's flight plan looks like, and I went for the standard Lido layout for the plan. We are departing from Delhi and then we're basically flying all the way down to Mumbai. Now I'm using the standard Lido layout, which is important because it contains all of our waypoint coordinates. We are flying the 707 with the INS configuration today, but if you're looking for the FMS, that's just going to make your life a little bit easier. Now, we need the coordinates for our INS entries. That's the reason why I went for the standard Lido layout. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and board our aircraft. For the purpose of this tutorial, I am going to make significant use of the Navigraph charts and SimBrief dispatch app, which we are going to use for everything related to navigation. But you can also do this with the standard flight simulator chart. However, I would very strongly advise to use SimBrief for your flight plan. Alright, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and start with a bit of basic stuff here. We're going to start on the Navigraph chart app, where we are going to import our flight, which is already loaded by default down here. Now from here we're going to go onto the export screen, and I'm going to click Load as Active Flight Plan in the simulator. What this does is it basically creates the simulator flight plan for us. This will be important later when we go to the Boeing 707 app, because that one is now shown in the navigation log in here. Now, any simulator route is going to be loaded in there, so if you are just using SimBrief without the Navigraph app, you can always just export it from the SimBrief dispatch and then load the route in the flight simulator like that. Now, since we have imported the flight in the Navigraph app, let's also go to SimBrief dispatch, and we are going to import it down here as well, so that we've got our flight plan and route readily accessible over here. Now, with that in mind, let's quickly go into the Boeing 707 app and go over the basic settings that I'm going to use for today's tutorial. So on the Flight Engineers tab, you could automate any of the procedures for the flight engineer that we are going to go over in this tutorial. So if you do not want to do that stuff manually, you can have it done automatically by just clicking the procedure in question and then clicking Run. Now, we're not going to do that for this tutorial. We want to learn how the entire airplane works. So let's just hit Reset All over here, which is also how you can reset the flight engineer after you have completed the flight if you want to do a second flight. Now, we will turn all the automatic monitoring features on. So this is for the fuel feed, so that the tanks are getting balanced. However, I will talk about how to balance them manually in the cruise portion of this tutorial. Then we got fuel temperature monitoring on, air source, and EPR bugs, the latter of which is especially important because it means that the flight engineer is going to set our maximum thrust bugs on the EPR gauge over here, which is rather important for knowing the maximum thrust that the engine can use at all times. Apart from that, going down into the options, here's what my options look like for the purpose of this tutorial. App theme really just changes it between light and dark, so that doesn't really matter. Altitude mode selector, this is an important one. I've selected it to pre-selector. Now, the alerter function is only going to give you an alert when you reach the target altitude, while the pre-selector function will actually make the autopilot intercept and level off at that altitude. If you are not using the pre-select option, if you're using the alerter, then you will have to level off manually, and after you level off, engage the altitude hold mode. Now, apart from that, HSI behavior is modern, and we are going to synchronize the altimeters. We have realistic park and brake behavior, we have realistic clock and chronometer behavior, and then finally, we do have our flight engineer options down there as well, which is mainly the throttle, climb and takeoff thrust assistance, which I'm going to explain later on when we get to that part in the tutorial, and all the other flow callouts and in-flight callouts are also switched on. Now that's basically our setup that we are going to use for today's flight. Apart from that, our airplane is configured in pounds. You can see that on the fuel gauges over here, and we are using the INS equipped version of the Boeing 707, since that is how most 707s flew in the real world. Well, and that is our general setup for today's flight. With that, let's go straight into the actual aircraft setup. This is all based on the amplified procedures that you can find in the operations manual. Simply Google for it and you will find it straight away on the flightsimulator.com website, which I can really recommend if you want to read up a little bit of stuff or if you want to visualize the procedures that we are going to do. We're going to start this one with the cockpit safety inspection, and this is fairly easy. It's the emergency flap switch in the off, respectively guarded position. The landing light switches are all off, which in today's configuration is forward. Note that you can change the configuration between forward and backward, and quite a lot of operators actually did that. So that is an option down in the EFB. Today we are using the option that everything set to forward actually equals off. Okay, so the emergency flap switch is guarded, the landing lights are off, the landing gear lever is down, the radar mode selector is off, the transponder mode selector is off, and then we can move to the flight engineers panel, and over here we got the galley power switch off, and next let's just move the seat backwards so that we can see the rest of the panel. The AC auxiliary hydraulic pumps are off, and finally the fuel dump panel is covered. And that's our cockpit safety inspection complete. With that, we can go into the preliminary preparation. For that, let's move over to the flight engineer's seat. We're going to start by checking all of our circuit breakers, making sure that they're all in. Can abbreviate that because the circuit breakers are not simulated. Then we move on to the radio master switches, which are set off, and then we check that the external power is set off. Next, we rotate the battery selector, or rather the load and volt selector, onto the battery position. We check that we have sufficient voltage and that the battery doesn't have any excessive loads. Now, let's go ahead and turn the battery on. And next up, we are going to move down to the APU panel, which is located down here. We are going to do the APU fire test, like that. And next, we start the APU by moving the master switch to on, and then temporarily to start, and back to on. And you can see the APU is now starting to spool up. Note that the APU has its own small DC fuel pump, so it can get fuel even if all the AC fuel pumps are turned off. However, we are going to relieve it very soon after the APU has started. For now, let's wait until the APU reaches somewhere above 90%, basically when it stabilizes, like this. Now we move up to the AC panel and we got the AC paralleling selector. That one is going to be switched to APU, and then we can turn the APU generator switch down here on. Here we go, the ammeter now shows a load, and then we can turn the APU bleed valve on to get air conditioning. Finally, let's move back up to the electrical panel and make sure that the essential power selector is set to APU. Alright, lastly, we move up to the overhead panel and we switch on the radio master switches. With that, let's move into the preliminary cockpit preparation, and if you are using an INS powered aircraft, the first step for us is to switch the INS mode selector into Align, so that the system starts aligning, as the alignment time can take quite a while. Next up, we have to enter our initial position. For that, we rotate the mode selector into the POS tab, which stands for surprise position, and over here we are going to enter our current airplane position. Now, if you have your airplane position written somewhere on the gate, just use that. If not, you gotta go into the charts, and then you will find a chart that contains all your INS positions, or rather your coordinates. So if we just move that one up onto the taxi tab of the Navigraph charts, you can see that an INS coordinate chart is available over here, and it will be available for pretty much any airport, so that you can get your actual position right from the charts. Today we do have it available up here on the gate, so let's go ahead and use that. And our coordinates are north 2833, and we got around the last one, 0.1. So what we do on the INS is, with the mode selector in position, we click the 2 key, which also has the north button on there. That enables us to enter a north coordinate, like that. You can see now the display turns all zeros, and now we can enter the coordinates. So we're at north 2833.1. So we enter 2833.1, check the coordinate over here, and then we press insert. Next, we have our east coordinate at 77050. So let's go over here, east 77050. And we check that this coordinate is showing correctly as it should, which it does over here. So let's hit insert. With that done, we can move the mode selector to status, and we can now see the alignment taking place. So what are we looking at? Basically that number over here. It'll start usually at 7, and then it slowly counts down, and by the time it reaches 5, the ready nav light is going to illuminate, and you could switch the INS mode selector into nav. However, for greater accuracy, wait until this actually runs all the way down. Okay, now with that done, our alignment is in progress, and we can focus on the preliminary preparation. So, first step is to set the panel lights, which you have up here. So what I'm going to do is to set the overhead lights, the captain's instrument panel, the forward center panel, as well as the first officer's instruments panel. That basically turns all the backlighting of our instruments to the maximum, and that's going to be our light setup for now. Next, we move down here and start with the Mach airspeed warning test. And you could hear the overspeed warning for that. Then we do the Mach trim test. And that one is normally, when you release the switch, going to leave the disengage light on. The way you re-engage this is by going down to the stabilizer trim cutout switches, moving them to cutout, then you move the trim manually for a short moment, and then you turn the switches back on, and that's going to re-engage your Mach trim. Alright, with that the test is successful. Then we move back to the overhead panel, and now we're basically going over the complete panel. So we're starting up here. Windshield wipers are in park. The brake panel, we can test the anti-skid by moving the selector to the inboard position. Now we should see the inboard lights come on. This is a bug in the current version. And the same also applies to the outboard position. Then we move down, we check that the rudder and spoiler switches are guarded, we check that the nacelle anti-ice switches are off and the lights are not illuminated, and the nose cooling is switched off. Moving into the second column, we check that the compass is set to slave, the ground proximity warning switch is guarded, we can test our flight recorder, and for that we should check that the monitor moves up, then we release it and it moves back down the needle. Alright, on the cell call panel, we check that the cell call is set to VHF or HF, or off if you do not expect to use it as appropriate. Now, since we are not going to fly over any areas where cell call might be required today, we're just going to leave the selectors on off and the marker sensitivity in low. Moving down, our wing anti-ice is switched off. Going into the third column, the passenger oxygen switch is off, the emergency lights are guarded, the seatbelt and no smoking signs are on. We can test the ground warning call, which you should hear in the background, and we're going to test the cabin attendant call, which we can hear now. Next up, we turn the yaw damper on, and then we are moving on into the fourth column, where we once again got the first officer's compass switch, which is slaved. Moving down, we do not need to conduct the altitude warning test, and the HF radios are set as required. Since MSFS doesn't support HF, they're off. Moving up then, we got onto the 4th column. Over here we flick the flight recorder on, the lights are set as needed. Then, moving up here, the probe heat is off, the forward cargo smoke detector is off, the window heat can be switched to low, and then we test the overheat systems like that. If the lights stay on, you can reset them by putting the selectors back to off and then back into the low position. We are going to test the pitot and attitude warning heaters, and we can see that we do get the voltage on them, and then we can switch them back off again. Moving forward, we get to the lights panel. Starting from the right, the strobe lights are off, the taxi and turn-off lights, or rather the taxi and wing lights, are switched off, the beacon is off, the navigation light can come on, the runway turn-off lights are switched off, and the landing lights are all off. Going down, we got the main panel, and over here we can test the engine fire warnings, like that. Then we move on to the main panel. Over here, we make sure that the altimeter correction is switched off. Then, pulling the yoke a little backwards, we got a couple of switches down here, and we basically check that everything is set to our side. So we're sitting on the left side over here, so it's all set to the number 1 side, except for the ADF RMI compass, which is set to normal, which is number 2. Okay. Moving further up, we check that we do not have any nonsense indications on our instruments, basically all the way over, and then we can set our QNH, which I'm going to get from the Navigraph app here. You could listen to the ATIS at this point, you just need the QNH, which is 1001 right now. Alright, and that is set. Then we test our radio altimeter, and we set the minimum to 20 feet so that the MDA and minimum light aren't coming on at any time where we do not want them. The emergency brake selector is off, that selector is normal, and then moving on to the right hand side, the EPR reads 1.0 on each engine. The box can be moved, we just check that real quick to make sure that nothing is stuck over there since it's mechanical instruments. Then, moving on to the right hand side where we got the light switch, which we're going to set to dim, make sure that the lights actually dim, and then we can switch it back as needed. So during operation in the darkness, you would set it to dim, otherwise in the daylight, leave it on bright. Moving over to the first officer's panel, we once again check our radio altimeter, like that, and again, we just see normal indications here, nothing broken. Alright, moving further down then, we can set our initial altitude if we know it already. To make the purpose easy for this tutorial, we're climbing 34,000 feet, so I'm going to set this all the way up to 34,000. Normally you would select your initial climb. Moving down to the weather radar panel, we make sure that the range is selected as appropriate, and we're going to go with minimum range for takeoff over here. The antenna is tilted up, usually about 5 degrees, since that is going to equal your normal flight path angle after takeoff, and the mode selector switch stays on off. The transponder is off, and we can set 2000 as our default IFR squawk. Now, moving on to the throttle quadrant. The speed brake lever is full forward. Then we move on to our thrust levers, and we move the engine number 3 lever all the way forward, and check that the takeoff configuration sound comes on, and then we move that back. Alright, the flap lever is in agreement with the actual flap position, which we can read on the flap gauge over here, and they are retracted right now, and so is the lever. The trim is set to an appropriate value. So, moving further down, the park and brake is set, and note that if you've got the realistic park and brake option enabled, you need to press your brake pedals to be able to set the brakes. So let's just demonstrate that. If the park and brake is released, first press your pedals, hold them pressed, then you can set the park and brake, and when the red light comes on, you can release the pressure on your pedals. The engine start levers are in the cutoff position, the stabilizer trim cutout switches are in the forward position, the DME is switched on the radios, and at this time you could set your frequencies, but I'm going to delay that a little bit until we do our navigation setup. Moving down to the autopilot, the autopilot mode selector is on manual, the turn selector is in the 12 o'clock position, the autopilot is off, and the altitude hold switch is off, which is the middle position. Next up we got the flight director switches. I would recommend to set the pitch command to approximately 10 degrees up, since that's going to equal our initial climb pitch. The mode selectors are off on both sides, and the altitude hold selectors are off. Now we've got our ADF where the tone switches are off and the frequency is set as appropriate. You can switch on the ADFs down here at this point. Now we've got our aft panel lighting switch, which is basically the backlighting of the panel, which we set as needed. So I'm going to put that all the way up. And then our rudder trim and our aileron trim are both set into the neutral position. The horn cutout switch is in the forward position, and that's our main panel set. Finally, let's move to the side panel over here, where we got a couple more switches. So that's the oxygen regulator, which we basically just want to ensure is switched on. Then our audio controls, we set the VHF 1 and 2 radius on. We make sure that VHF 1 is selected for our audio controls, and the mic selector is set to either the interphone or the radio, which is what I've selected right now. Alright, let's also turn on the volume of the interphone so that we can hear our colleague later on. Okay, and that basically concludes our setup for the forward stations. Now let's move back to the flight engineer station. Over here we have a couple things that we need to set up. So let's go ahead and start this with the panel lights on the side. So I'm going to turn the panel light all the way up, and I'm going to turn the circuit breaker lights all the way up, so that we can see a little bit better on the panel over here, since it's a rather dark panel. Now we are going to start at the very top of the panel on the electricals. The galley power is off, the alternate fuel flow meter power switch is in normal, the IDG disconnects are all guarded, the battery is on, and now we move through the load selector and just verify the load and the voltage of all the transformer rectifiers, all units, and then we're going to leave the mode selector on the essential TR. Moving further down, our external power is not required since we're operating on the APU, the bus tie breakers are guarded, the circuit open lights are on, and the generator control switches are guarded. Moving further down, our parallel link selector is just moved through all the different units just to make sure that the lights come on to know that those are operating correctly. Moving further down then, we get into the fuel system where the engine valves are all open. Then we're going to test our fuel pumps by turning the forward pumps, that's the one with the F, on all tanks where there is actually fuel located in them. So that is everything except the center tank right now. Then we can switch those back off, and then we're going to do the same with the aft boost pumps to make sure that they all come on, and then we can switch them back off, except for the number 2 tank aft pump, which is where the APU also feeds its fuel from, so that way we are now relieving the APU DC pump by operating the AC driven pump. Moving further down, we are going to check that the reserve tank valves as well as the cross-feed valves are all operating correctly. So we just open them, make sure that the blue light comes on and extinguishes again, and then we can set all of those back off again. The fuel temperature selector is just rotated through all the different selections to make sure that the fuel temperature is appropriate, namely more than minus 37 degrees and less than plus 50 degrees. And then we move back to the number 1 tank. Next we got our fuel gauge test, so we push the button, make sure that the quantities all go down to the minimum, and then we can release the button again. Moving further down, the fuel heaters are all in the guarded position, and that leads us to the hydraulics, which are located down here. We ensure that our reservoir is actually full, we ensure that the engine pumps are on, and the hydraulic fluid shutoff valves are in the guarded position. From here, we are going to move on and set the interconnect valve to the brake position. Then we're going to switch on the AC auxiliary pump number 2, make sure that the low pressure light goes off, and we verify that the system pressurizes normally. Now, when that is done, we can move the interconnect valve into the system position. Then we turn number 2 off, number 1 on, make sure that number 1 takes over, and we're also going to release and set the parking brake at this point, and verify that our pressure stays within acceptable limits over here. Alright, like that. So that's all looking good. So we are going to leave the AC pump number 1 on, and then we can move to the engine vibration test. We'll make sure that the pickup selector is on the diff position, then we press and hold the button, make sure that all the units go up to 4 within plus minus 0.5, and then we move the pickup selector to turb, again press the switch, make sure that they all move normally, then we can release the switch and return the pickup selector to the diff position. Okay, fuel flow meter reset switches as needed. If you need to reset your fuel used, you can do that. Then we move further up, make sure that the equipment cooling is normal. Next up we got the engine oil quantity, which we're going to test, making sure that the quantity goes to 0. And then we can release the switches again and it goes back up. Moving further up onto our air conditioning panel, we verify that the rate selector is just above the dot. We select our cruising altitude plus 2,000 feet, so we plan to cruise in level 340, so we're going to set this all the way up to flight level 360. Note that the cruise levels are located on the left-hand side of the indicator and the associated cabin altitudes on the right-hand side. The barometer selector is set as needed, the outflow valves are set to normal, the switch is set to hold, auto is selected, and then we move the takeoff selector down to the landing position and verify that the outflow valves are opening. Then we move back to takeoff and verify that the valves are closing. Moving up then, we check that the differential pressure is 0, the cabin vertical speed is also 0, and then we just go through all the different cabin air selectors to verify that we are getting air at appropriate temperatures over here. And note that this is Fahrenheit, so looking at something, 75-ish degrees. Okay, moving further up, our target cabin temperatures should be about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. The engine bleed air valves are all selected off, the wing valves are open, and the air conditioning units are switched off. Moving further up, our air compressors are all switched off. The ram air switch and the crew auxiliary heat valves are guarded. And moving to the coolant air, we verify all the valves. So inlet is open, exit is closed, the secondary heat exchange is open, and the turbofan exit is closed. And the temperature controls are off. Then we can return that to whatever you deem necessary. The controllers are in the off position and the turbofan exit valve override switches are normal. Forward cargo compartment heater as needed. If you got anything in there that does need heating, then you can switch that on, otherwise leave it off. Moving further down to the crew compartment auxiliary heater, the cargo door heater is on. The gas fan can be controlled as needed. I'm going to leave this one on so that we have a little bit of additional cooling provided by circulating the air inside the aircraft. The cabin air conditioning is set as needed and the overheat valve is off, and with that one you can basically increase or decrease the temperatures on the respective sections. Down here is your fuel dumping door. That one is supposed to be closed, just to show you what it looks like. Here it is, and basically you got the master switches, and then you got these separate tank valves, so just make sure that this one is guarded. Interphone is selected off, and then going down here, our oxygen pressure is appropriate, our oxygen supply on the mask is tested, then we can switch it back off. Door warning test, all of those illuminate. Down here we got our flight recorder, where we are going to enter our flight number and the date of the flight. So if we look into the electronic flight back down here, can just go into the SimBrief dispatch. We are the Air India flight 2933, so let's dial that one up. 2933, and the date today is the 16th, so let's go ahead and put that up. Finally, the mode selectors are set off. Alright, our flight engineer wants to transmit on VHF1, of course, or on the interphone as needed. And the associated volume is set up. Alright, and down here is just the APU panel that we've already dealt with earlier. And that basically concludes the setup of our flight deck. So let's now go up front and start looking into our navigation systems and the takeoff performance. The first thing I want to look at over here is the INS, and you can see that by now the status has counted down to 0, which is the highest possible accuracy. And once that is achieved, we can turn the mode selector into the nav position. Next up, we need to prepare our departure, and for that, let's just have a very quick look into what we've got available for today's flight. Unfortunately, and you will notice that with most flights that you want to do with the INS, most airports have switched to RNAV-only departures, and that is actually the case for Delhi over here as well. So if you go into the SID chart, you can see it's basically all just RNAV stuff. However, we do have some initial climb procedures published, which I'm going to pin down here. And looking at this, departing runway 29, our SID is to climb straight ahead to 1700 and then a left turn onto a 210 heading, unless you've got a published SID that would look different. We do have a published SID today, which we can see over here. 1700, left turn, Delta Papa 666, Delta Papa 787, and then Dudum, and thereafter the filed routing. Now what we are going to do here is to fly that initial climb procedure and then proceed direct Delta Papa 666 to pick up our standard navigation. So how am I going to program that? That's where the SimBrief dispatch page comes in really handy. Or if you do have a Navigraph subscription, I would actually recommend to use the chart app. Now, if you have some sort of real-life tablet to pick up the PDF version of your flight plan, I would strongly recommend to do that, because it means that you can actually draw on the flight plan. And what we want to do here is to note the numbers in the INS for each of those waypoints. So, how are you going to do that? Well, assuming that you have some sort of capability to draw on the flight plan, so, you know, either by printing it out or taking it onto a tablet, I'm going to go into the Navigraph app here because it offers that possibility. Go to Flights and then SimBrief OFP. You can see we can open the OFP in here and we actually have the ability to draw on that flight plan. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to start with a couple of basic things, and that is actually loading our airplane. So for today's flight we need 43,000 pounds of fuel. And going into the SimBrief app, we need 114 passengers and 47,400 pounds of cargo. So I'm just going to do this quite simply. I will press the import weight switch, and that's automatically going to load our airplane. Now, the 707 doesn't come with its own load selector, so if you do not want to do it automatically from SimBrief, then you can go down here onto the aircraft menu, flight performances, mass and balance. Now make sure that you go onto the thumb wheel over here and select a good average mass for your passenger. The default is set to 400 pounds, which is much too heavy. So make sure that you select something decent here, like 182, that happened automatically with our SimBrief loading. Like that, we are already fully loaded with our cargo, our passengers, and our fuel. And note that our fuel is distributed so that we got the same quantities in tanks 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. If you use the default selector like this, you can see that it kind of doesn't do that. So you just want to be sure that that is all set correctly. Now, with that done, let's return into the OFP, and now let's fill out what we got. So for the fuel, we loaded exactly what we're supposed to have, and I'm just gonna denote that in the flight plan down here. So we got 42,422 pounds of fuel loaded, and that is a pick extra of 0, like that, and reason for extra is of course nil. Now we are gonna scroll down. Ooh, here we go. And now let's go ahead and scroll down and start filling in our flight plan, and this is where things really get interesting. So if you are flying a mix of a conventional departure and an RNAV departure, you got to find the right point where you want to pick up INS navigation. For us, that's fairly easy today, since we climb straight ahead to 1700 and then make our left-hand turn over here onto a 210 heading. And thereafter, we are going to pick up the navigation direct to Delta Papa 666. So for us, Delta Papa 666 will be the first waypoint where we are going to pick up INS navigation. So, how are we going to enter all those waypoints? Let's talk a little bit about some INS theory. First of all, the mode selector goes to waypoint, and then select waypoint number 1. Note that waypoint 0 is always your present position, so you do not try to override that. You start with waypoint number 1. For that, we enter Delta Papa 666. Now what we are going to do here is to open our flight plan, like this, find the coordinates of Delta Papa 666, and then we can enter those coordinates over here. So we do this the same way that we entered the present position earlier, by clicking N if you want to enter a north coordinate, or S if you want to enter a south coordinate. Now we can see this is the north coordinate starting here at 2814.9. So N 2814.9. Insert. Now we got the east coordinate down there at 76550. So next up we press east, 76550. That's all looking good down there. And then we can press insert, and with that, waypoint number 1 is entered. Next, let's go ahead and denote that on our flight plan. And for that, we want to again go down here. And this is waypoint number 1. Alright, next we continue with Delta Papa 787, and that's at 2758.3. So waypoint number 2, north, 2758.3. Insert, and east, 7644, and insert. Next we go on to waypoint number 3. So write down the number, and then number 3 is going to become Dudum, 27480. So that's 27480, enter, and east, 76314, enter. Alright. So with that, waypoint number 3 is entered. Now we continue to waypoint number 4, and like that we are going to program all the waypoints. So that's 2731.4, enter, east, 7618.8, enter. So that's waypoint number 4 entered. Alright, next is going to be Jaipur VOR. So that's number 5 at 2649.5. Insert, and east 7553. Enter. Alright, so Jaipur is entered. So the next waypoint in our flight plan is the Topper Climb, and we're not going to enter that one, since that's more or less an artificial waypoint. So number 6 is going to become Nikot, and that's at 2552.9. and 7526.4. Alright, so Nikot is entered as our number 6. Okay, next comes Abduk, that's number 7, and that's 2434.5. And the east coordinate is going to be 7454.5. Alright, then waypoint number 8, Agupa, 24014. Insert, and 7441.2. Like that, so here is waypoint number 7, that's number 8, and finally number 9, Agrix at 23094. Accidentally pressed waypoint change, that doesn't do anything here, but verify your coordinates, so 23094, insert, and east 7424. Alright, insert. And that's all the waypoints we could enter, now entered. So with that done, let's quickly write those down. Here's number 7, here's number 8, and here's number 9. Like that, we now know which of those waypoints are which waypoints in our flight plan. So, when the IRS alignment is completed, we do a little sanity cross-check. For that, we rotate the mode selector to distance and time. Now we enter waypoint change 0, 1, like that. And that basically is a direct from the present position, which is always 0, to the first waypoint. We can insert that, and you can see we got a distance of 20 nautical miles. We can compare that with our flight plan, and if we look over here, we can see the ring is always 25 miles, so that's roughly 20 nautical miles. In other words, our alignment is on the correct position, and the first waypoint is correct as well. Like that, you can now go through all the different waypoints, and you can cross-check that every single one of them is correct. So, Going down here, got a distance of 41 miles, then we continue, waypoint 2 to 3, distance 54 miles, and so on. Now, normally, this should give us the distance from that waypoint to that waypoint. So, I believe in the INI builds it currently gives us present position to that waypoint. So, that's not working 100% the way that I think it should right now, but, you know, it's something, it works. Well, and like that, we have prepared our INS. Next up, for our departure, since we are going to climb straight ahead to 1700 and then left onto a heading of 210, let's go ahead and set the runway heading. So we're departing 29 right, that's a heading of 283. So let's go down here, set the heading bug towards 283. Pretty much like that. And as a reminder, I'm going to set my course towards 210. Note that if this doesn't work the way you expect it to, go to the 707 and disable auto slew course for localizer. That option can change your course setting. So if you can't change it, then you may want to disable this. Alright, so like that we got the initial runway heading and we have a reminder for what our first track is going to be. Alright, and that finishes the initial setup for our navigation. Next up, let's get our takeoff data in. For that, we got the data card tab over here, and this one automatically fills for the present gross weight. You can press the update button over here if you want to be 100% sure, and this tells you a lot of interesting things. You got the takeoff flap setting, which is basically always 14 in the 707. You got the required stabilizer trim. You got the time that it takes to dump fuel to reach your maximum landing weight from the takeoff weight. And then you got the minimum runway length that you require for this takeoff. Now, based on all of that data that you see down here, it calculates the EPR settings for your takeoff and the takeoff speeds. Now you could go ahead and select all of those manually on the speed box over here. Or if you're lazy like me, you simply press set box. That's going to set your speed box. So you got V1, VR, V2. Then you got your flap retraction and your clean speed. And then you can also press set trim in order to trim the aircraft automatically down here. Well, and that's our performance setup. We also verify the takeoff EPR 1.81 is bugged up here. Well, with that we got our initial altitude, we got our en route navigation, we got our takeoff navigation. And note that if you intend to use any VORs, you could tune them down here as well. You do not have a pre-selector, you simply have the active frequency. The same also goes for the COM, where you can set your frequencies like that. Alright, and then standard is going to be the guard frequency on COM2, so 1 to 1.5, like that, and COM1 to whatever is needed for active ATC. Alright, and that basically finishes our setup for our departure. If you want a flight director, remember you do not have a takeoff mode. You can select the mode selector, for example, the heading, and that's going to give you a flight director for your runway heading that we've set over here with a 10 degrees pitch. You can do that, you don't have to do that, up to you, since the autopilot basically follows its own commands and not the flight director commands. Okay. So that's now everything that we need for our performance setup. With that completed, let's go ahead and prepare our airplane for the pushback and the startup. So first things first, let's go ahead and call for GSX to start our pushback so that we've got that done. Now we'll just take something over here. Then we make sure that all of our doors are closed on the door panel over here. Then we quickly run to the outside view and remove the chocks. And if you forget that step, the pushback is gonna look fancy. So that is definitely something that you want to do over here. Alright, with that done, let's return to our flight deck. And then we can go ahead and get our pushback and startup clearance. Once the clearance is received, we are going to switch on the beacon. We are going to ensure that the galley power is switched off, as the APU is not capable of providing enough power. And we make sure that our air conditioning unit switches are all off. Well, and that's our before start procedure complete. So now we could read the before start checklist. Something you could do at this point is to turn the forward fuel pumps on. It's not really in the procedure, but it is considered good practice to do that at this time. Alright, so once our pushback clearance is granted, let's switch the transponder into standby so that it can start getting ready for the operation. And note that back in the days on the 707, the transponder would only be turned on when we line up on the runway. But note that if you are flying on VATSIM, they want you to have the transponder on basically now. So you would switch it into the on position so that you actually get a ground radar signal. Back in the 707 days, ground radar would not be coupled to your transponder, so there would be nothing to worry about at this point. Alright, so we are fully prepared for pushback and startup now. Let's go ahead and as soon as GSX is ready, we just have to release our parking brake and then we can get going. So let's get GSX, continue pushback. It's going to be nose to the left-hand side, and then the pushback is approved, parking brake released, and like that we are now going to start moving. The engine start in the 707 is fairly easy. It's going to be start sequence 3421. The start switches are located up here, and we can go ahead and start the engines now. So let's take the engine start control, put it to ground start.
Engine start valve.
You can hear our... oh, hello there. God damn you, GSX. So, our N2 starts increasing at 15%.
15% N2. Lever to start.
We'll put the lever to start. Now the engine is igniting, spooling up, and next up we will get starter cutout at 35, and at 50% we are going to move the engine start lever from start into idle. So here's starter release. Now we're waiting for 50%. Technically speaking, we could already initiate the next engine start now. Here we go. Alright, and now let's guard that switch and start engine number 4. So, I just said that we do not want to start several engines at the same time. Why is that? The airplane does not have FADEC. Therefore, you are completely responsible for the engines in case something goes wrong. So if you've got a hung start, a hot start, or a wet start, it's up to you as pilot to correct for that. And that's the reason why we want to start the engines basically one at a time, at least until they have reached a point at 50% where they are basically in the self-sustaining RPMs, which means that even without starter assistance, the engine has basically completed a successful start. Okay, so we've started number 3 and 4. Let's go ahead and guard that switch and then start engine number 2. And let's just have a little look at the gauges themselves. You can see two different parts on the gauges. You got the large one, which is the 10s, and the small one, which is the 5s. Or rather the 1s. So the large needle isn't entirely accurate. So you basically want to use the large needle to see the 10s and then the small needles to see the 1s. So 35% here, even though the needle itself was still somewhere around 33 or so. They're not all that accurate. It's not a completely modern aircraft, but it gets the job done, and that's the reason why you've got the second indicator down there. Alright, one more engine to go. Let's start engine number 1. So you can nicely see that here. There's 10% on the needle, but it's actually 12%. And 15 down here, it's more like 14 on the large needle. So that's why it's important that you look at the small needles as well. Our pushback is completed, set brakes. So again, tap the pedals, then set the brakes. Here's 35, the starter releases. Now we're waiting for 50. Lever to idle, and that's the engine start procedure completed. Alright, so let's go ahead with the after start procedure. And for that, we go back to the flight engineer's seat, and we got quite a bit of stuff to do back here. So, first things first, APU bleed valve can go off, and then we're going to establish airplane electrical power. Now, this is something quite interesting. What we are going to have to do here is to go and take the parallel link selector and select an engine-driven generator, for example, generator number 1. Now, you can see the white lights that are flashing over here. We got a generator frequency controller down here, and we basically rotate this until the lights basically flash with the least possible frequency. We're basically just rotating this in an attempt to make the lights flash as little as possible. The only problem here is that in the current version of the airplane there seems to be some bug there, which basically prevents that from happening. So, unfortunately for the sim, we can't wait until this extinguishes, but we simply have to go ahead and close the generator breaker. So once this gets updated, make sure that these basically stop flashing by rotating the frequency control, and only then close the generator breaker. Okay, and then we are basically going to do the same with generator number 2. We're going to do the same with generator number 3. That one. And then we do the same with generator number 4. Finally, we select the essential power selector to a generator as needed, and we basically want to make sure that they are all not illuminating the failure light. Then we're going to leave it on number 1. So, with that done, we've now established AC electrical power. Let's move up to the air conditioning panel and start our air compressors, all 4 of them. And then we can also turn the engine bleed air on. We can turn the air conditioning unit on as needed. You don't have to turn it on. I'm gonna turn it on right now though. Galley power comes on, and then we move down to the fuel boost pump switches, and we're gonna switch the pumps on for any tank that has fuel in them. Moving down to the hydraulic system, the AC auxiliary pumps number 1 and 2 come on. The interconnect valve goes into the off position. And after a little while, so basically after we've done all the rest, we just move up to the air compressors again. Make sure that the low oil pressure light does not illuminate and that they are running normal. When all of that is done, we move down to the APU panel and move the master switch into the off position. And with that, we can read the after start checklist. So let's go ahead and go into the taxi procedures. Now, the taxi procedure actually starts with a couple more switches. So we want to turn the pitot and static heaters on, and then we can turn the turn-off lights on, the taxi lights on, like that. And with that done, we make sure that the stabilizer trim is set for takeoff, the flaps are set to 14, and yes, this is all part of the taxi procedure here. I haven't mixed up my procedures. Well, and with that, we are ready to taxi. So, let's go ahead and get out our charts. We're standing down here on apron 34, and we'll taxi out, straight out, link 7, alpha, and then via alpha, all the way to the full length for runway 29 right. So we verify that we're clear on the left side, that we are clear on the right hand side. We can get our armrests down, release the park and brake, and then we can go. If you're at a light weight, especially after landing, the airplane is going to taxi on idle thrust. You can see how it very slightly creeps forward, right here and right now as well. But you will usually need a little bit of thrust to get your airplane moving. The engines are rather unresponsive at low thrust settings, so be a little careful when you operate them at low thrust settings. You basically want to keep the N1 below 50%, which is the limit for ground operations. And you will notice that even at the max takeoff weight, the engines are the airplane is going to move fairly fine if you go to 50% N1. You do not have a ground speed indication, except for the INS, which you could rotate all the way into track and ground speed. Down here you have your ground speed. Use that to get comfortable with the way that the airplane looks when you taxi, but in the real world you would taxi it completely from feeling and you would not use any ground speed reference during your taxi. The 707 does need a little bit of an oversteering, so be prepared for that. It doesn't need as much as other wide-body aircraft, since technically speaking this isn't a wide-body, it's a single-aisle aircraft. So basically just give it a little bit of an oversteering like this. Keep the main wheels centered on the centerline, aka keep the centerline in the middle of the main wheels. You will get the grips of this rather quickly. The 707 is a very hands-on airplane to taxi. Alright, so now that we're on a long straight line, let's go ahead and accelerate a little bit, and let's use the time to talk about the maximum taxi speeds that you should adhere to. So on an apron, so basically after pushback, the maximum speed should be 15 knots. For a turn that's tighter than 30 degrees, you shouldn't exceed 10 knots, and on a long straight line like we are right now, a taxi speed of up to 30 knots is permissible. If you're backtracking a runway, you can go all the way up to 50 knots. Now, if the surfaces are contaminated with, ice or slush or water of more than 3 millimeters, then you should limit your speed as much as reasonable, and speeds of 5 knots or less could very well be used, especially in turns on contaminated surfaces. As mentioned, use the ground speed on the INS to see how fast you're going, and get yourself a good picture, get yourself a good feeling of which ground speed is associated with which picture outside of the aircraft. And that's basically how you taxi a 707. You will notice that the 707 is a pretty gentle aircraft to taxi. You basically go up to speed, and when you're up at speed you can return your thrust levers to idle. The airplane is going to slow down gradually, but you can see, especially at weights for intermediate flight length, it will taxi fairly well in idle thrust. Only when you go into very tight turns is when you need more than idle for the turns. So that's really only for, those turns where you go into a 90-degree turn. Then you might have to add a little bit of thrust in the turn in order not to lose your speed. You basically want to avoid coming to a complete stop during a turn with the nose wheel still deflected, as an excessive amount of thrust would be needed to get the aircraft to move again. There are no special techniques here, no adding thrust on the outboard engine during a turn. We don't do that on the 707. It's symmetrical thrust, as good as you can. Alright, and that's really everything that goes into the taxi procedure on the 707. What you want to do while you're taxiing to the runway is to revise the takeoff briefing. So the minimum items you should go over are the takeoff thrust setting, your takeoff speeds, and ensuring that the bugs are set correctly. You want to revise your standard instrument departure, and once the taxi routing is clear and you no longer need the taxi chart, you could even go ahead and already open the SID chart so that you know where you're gonna fly. So 1700 on the heading book, and then left turn 210 degrees, and thereafter we're going to switch to INS navigation, and that's basically what we need down here. So keep an eye on that stuff so that you revise it as close as possible to the actual takeoff. Alright, we are approaching the runway threshold, so let's go ahead and slow down back to 10 knots. Again, if familiarize yourself with a look outside, use the INS or the FMS as needed, and do apply sufficient oversteering in order to get to a nice stop. Let's talk about stopping. The airplane has a cutoff angle of about 20 meters in front of your flight deck, so you basically want to bring the whole throttle line to just about here, just about to the bottom of the EFB on your window. If we look outside now, you can see we're nice and close to the whole throttle line, which is important because the way that airports are designed is that you have to taxi all the way forward to the whole throttle line so that other aircraft fit on the taxiways behind you. If you stop too far in the back, many flight simulators have that tendency to stop with that stop bar visible somewhere over here, then your airplane's tail is typically reaching into the area on the taxiway behind you. So let's go ahead and talk about a little bit of the theory for our takeoff before we execute the actual takeoff. For the theory, we are going to stabilize our engines at approximately 1.1 EPR. Once stabilized with the automatic flight engineer enabled, remember that's in the 707 app in the options, takeoff climb throttle assistance, I would strongly recommend to turn that on. With that option enabled, all you need to do after your engines are stabilized is to move the thrust levers all the way forward to the forward stop, and then your flight engineer is going to set the exact takeoff thrust. This resembles real-world procedure where the captain would just push the levers forward and then the flight engineer would take over and set an appropriate thrust setting. The flight engineer is also going to set climb thrust and stuff later on, but first of all, let's continue with our normal takeoff. We are going to verify that the takeoff thrust is set by the time we reach 80 knots. We are going to cross-check 80 knots on the speed indicators, and then we are going to return our control column to the neutral position because we do apply some slight forward pressure beforehand to increase the nose wheel steering effectiveness. Reaching V1, take your hand off the throttles. Reaching VR, smoothly rotate the aircraft to an initial pitch attitude of 15 degrees and maintain a steady climb at V2 to V2 plus 15. Now, remember to follow the SID. Today that's runway track until 1700 on the altimeter, so basically 1000 AGL, then a left turn heading to 10, and when we reach the thrust reduction and acceleration altitude, which is 1500 AGL, so 2300 on the altimeter, the flight engineer is going to reduce the engine thrust to the climb thrust setting all by himself. Do not touch your thrust lever, as that would override the input from the automatic flight engineer. Now, if you do touch the thrust levers, lucky you, he is going to set the box so that you can simply set the thrust manually so that the EPR reaches the EPR box. We are going to pitch down to approximately 5 degrees for the acceleration, and passing the flaps 14 reference speed, we can retract the flaps. That is our minimum clean speed on the last bug, but today we don't need to maintain that. We can accelerate all the way to 250 knots. Last but not least, a little tip on how to fly the speed accurately with a steam gauge aircraft. So the speed indicator isn't all that accurate, but you've got that little fast and slow gauge on the left hand side of your attitude indicator. You basically want to pitch the aircraft so that that circle is exactly in the middle of that indicator. Then you're flying the exact speed for which you've set your speed bump on the speed indicator. So that's basically how we're gonna fly this. Alright, so that's all we got for the theory. So let's go ahead and line up on the runway, and then we can get ready to depart. Note that we are using the automated flight engineer's monitoring features on this tutorial, so everything necessary on the flight engineer's panel is going to be set automatically so that we can focus on the task of the captain or the first officer, respectively the pilot flying. Alright, so what do we got? First of all, let's make sure our departure chart is open, and then let's go ahead and line ourselves up on the departure runway. For that, we turn the landing lights on. And note that we only turn the center lights on as soon as the takeoff clearance is received, which we assume to be the case. Then we turn our strobe light on. We make sure that our pitot and attitude warning heaters are turned on. We turn our weather radar on to the normal setting, and we make sure that our transponder is switched on. Alright, then let's release the parking brakes and let's line ourselves up on runway 29 right here at Delhi Airport. For the lineup, one very important thing that flight simulators tend to get wrong: do not follow the yellow line. The yellow line is designed for vacating the runway, not for lining up on it. You can nicely see that on the line in front over here. If you follow that line, you're gonna stop the aircraft somewhere over here. That wastes about 50 to 100 meters of runway, which you really do not want to waste. Instead, what we do is we approach the center line at a 90-degree angle. We wait until we sit roughly above the center line, and then we steer our aircraft straight onto the center line. Like this. Now, when you go to the outside, you can see we did use a little bit here of a distance, but if we had followed that yellow line, our main gears would have been up here, so that's basically half an airplane length of runway that we've just won over here. Alright, now let's go ahead and take off for our flight to Mumbai. Start the timer. Down here. Set to go. Then we stabilize our engines at an EPR of 1.1. Like this. And then throttles all the way forward. The automatic flight engineer is going to set the thrust, which is just announced as well. A little bit forward control column pressure. And that's checked. Control column back to neutral. Hands off the thrust lever. Smooth rotation of 15-degree pitch. Gear up. And the first thing you want to do now is to trim your airplane out. Now remember, the speed bug is V2. If you keep the circle in the middle, you're basically flying V2. Alright, let's engage the autopilot. And it will engage in wings level and with the current pitch of the aircraft. Reaching 1700, so let's go to heading mode and select heading 210. Like that. And then we can pitch down using the wheel over here. Pitch down to approximately 5 degrees of attitude. Alright, and like this we are now accelerating. So, passing the speed bug, we will get an announcement.
Speed check. Select flaps up.
And flaps up. So, let's set our target speed up to the next speed we want to fly, which is 250. That way, our fast-slow indicator is going to tell us exactly when we are reaching 250 knots. You will notice that lift increases as we accelerate. So like that, with a pitch of about 5 degrees, the airplane is going to stabilize in a nice climb, and once we're reaching 250, we just need to pitch up a little bit more manually, and that's already gonna be it. So we're reaching 250 now, so let's just pitch up a little bit, so that we stabilize our speed at 250 knots. You will notice that in most cases you're gonna get a rate of climb that's usually in the region of somewhere about 2,500 to 3,000 feet a minute over here. Alright, a little bit more like that. So let's now go into our climb procedure. The first thing we want to do is to start navigating by the INS. So here's how we do this. You're gonna press the waypoint change button so that the from to field starts blinking. Now press 0, which is the from waypoint, so our current position, and 1 for the first waypoint. Press insert. And now rotate the mode selector into the nav position. With that, the autopilot is now going to start to follow the navigation from the INS. You will notice that you do not get any indication about that on the main panel up here, unfortunately. Well, that's how it is. Not much you can actually do about that. But something you can do, select nav down there, And that tells you how much you're off track from the INS track. Now, the desired track will be shown to you down here with a selector in the desired track position. So 196 is the desired track. You can set this to 196, and now you know this is your target track. You're slightly left off track as the bar is deflected somewhat to the right, and that is what your airplane is aiming to follow right now. And that is what your airplane is going to stabilize on. Well, and that's how you can get some hints about the lateral navigation. For the distance to the waypoint, you got the INS on the distance to time selector, 6 miles to run, and that's our lateral navigation now there. If the plane goes into a little left-right circle, just enter the direct again, waypoint change 01 insert, and now it's centered on the present position again. Easy. Alright, once you've got flaps up no light, put the landing gear back into the off position, and with that we are stabilized in a nice climb out from Delhi over here. Next up, we're gonna reach 10,000 feet. Remember, you've got the hundreds here, and the tens are indicated over here on the 707's altimeter. So I'm passing 10,000, let's go ahead and pitch down to approximately 500 feet a minute. You can use both the left or the right hand wheel. Operate it slowly. Make sure that you do not actually accidentally start descending. And then when you're established in an almost level flight, set the speed target up to 300 knots, which is typical climb speed. Like this. And with that, we're establishing ourselves in a nice climb over here. We've passed a waypoint, so the new track should be 217, so let's go ahead and dial that up. 217, here we go. And now we're reaching our target speed again, and with the speed selector being almost centered, let's go ahead and pitch up a tiny bit so that we establish ourselves in a nice climb maintaining those 300 knots. Alright, so this looks pretty good. Established. Our speed is looking good. And you will notice that with the airplane, once the airplane is established and steady on the speed, you will not actually have to do many changes to your pitch. It's a fairly speed-stable aircraft. Alright, so we're climbing. We got a good 2,000 feet a minute. Our flight engineer has set the engines to climb thrust all by himself. So passing 10,000, couple things for us to do. Retractable landing lights, all of them are going off. The runway turn-off lights are going off, and the taxi lights are also going off. And lastly, once we're clear of any expected turbulence and safely above level 100, we can also switch the fasten seatbelt and the no smoking selectors into the off positions. Well, and with that, we're established in a nice and steady climb. Alright, so let's take a quick moment to talk about some of the autopilot features. You can see we've basically only done inputs on the autopilot panel. This does not synchronize the flight director, so the flight director is still aiming for the heading bug and the pitch target we gave it. So we should update the flight director as well here, with nav mode on both sides, and the pitch target somewhere around the first mark, which equals 5 degrees pitch. That's normally pretty much what you need for a steady climb in the 707. We can see our FMA on the top over here. The top equals the flight director mode, the bottom indicates the autopilot mode. So we can see we're navigating in nav mode, which is going to follow the INS track or the FMC track if you're flying an FMC equipped aircraft. VOR localizer, kind of self-explanatory, follows a VOR or a localizer. Then you got heading mode, and then you have altitude hold mode. Note that altitude hold in the 707 has two different modes. You can either automatically intercept the altitude that's pre-selected down here, or you can intercept it automatically depending on how the airplane is set up in the Boeing 707 menu on the options down here. If your altitude selector mode is set to alerter, then the airplane is not automatically going to level off, but much rather it's only going to give you an acoustic altitude alert when you're approaching the selected altitude. When it's set to pre-selector, then the airplane is going to level off automatically. So we're on pre-selector today. That means the airplane will level off automatically once we're reaching the flight level 340 that we've entered down here. Do note that the airplane is not going to do that when you have selected the alerter selection, which is more realistic for early Boeing 707s. Now, if that is the option you use, then you have to use the thumb wheel to pitch the aircraft to level off at the target altitude. And once you've leveled off, then you can engage altitude hold mode manually, and then the airplane is going to hold the selected altitude. And that's basically how this works. So, eventually we are passing the transition altitude, so let's select our altimeters to standard. And note that there are 4 altimeters which need to be set to standard. There's the captain's, the first officer's, the altitude alerter, which you can select using the knob down here. And then you also got the flight engineers panel, which you also need to select up there to the respective QNH. Now, we are automating the job of the flight engineer in this tutorial so that we can actually focus on flying the aircraft. But let's take a short moment to have a look at the important indications that we want to see on the flight engineers panel, because we always want to cross-check that the automatic flight engineer is actually doing his job correctly. So let's just move back over here. So, what's interesting to us? Most importantly is the cabin pressurization, which we got up here. A couple of things for us to check here. First of all, we want to see that the cabin differential pressure is rising. You're basically looking at 4 psi going through level 100, and then it's rising with the airplane climbing. You want to see a sensible vertical speed. Around 350 feet a minute is a standard vertical speed that you would expect. If you forget to pressurize the aircraft, the actual vertical speed is going to be much higher, more like 1,000 to 1,500. Then you want to check that your cabin altitude is climbing at an appropriate rate. So you can see we're at 4,860 feet of cabin altitude over here. The outflow valves should be at an appropriate setting, so if those would show completely open, then you would know something is wrong. And once we're in the air, we can actually select the landing mode on the mode selector over here. What this does is that the outflow valves are operating normally, but once the air-ground sensors sense that the airplane is in ground mode, the outflow valves are going to open completely. Lastly, we want to monitor our cabin temperature, which we can do through the different sections over here. And you can control the target cabin temperature using those knobs over here. The crew one is the upper one at 75 Fahrenheit, that's fairly good. And then you got the main cabin, which you can control using the lower knob. Now, that's the most important thing on the flight engineers panel. The second important thing for us is the fuel. We basically want to make sure that the fuel is always going to be balanced. Now, if you load your airplane through SimBrief, then the fuel would be balanced automatically if possible. You can see on a flight like this, it was easily possible. But we need to take a short moment here to talk about the maximum capacity of each tank and how the engineer would balance that fuel. I'm going to do it very brief for now. We'll go about it in more detail later on. You can see the tanks number 1 and 4, which are feeding engines 1 and 4 by default, can carry less fuel than the tanks number 2 and 3. So if you are taking off on a long haul flight or a longer medium haul flight, then you might have more fuel in the tanks number 2 and 3 than in the tanks number 1 and 4. What you would do now is to open all the cross-feed valves and then turn the pumps on the tank that has less fuel off until the fuel is stabilized between the different tanks. If the center tank has fuel, only open the center tank fuel pumps with all the cross-feed valves open, center pumps on, all the dedicated tanks 1, 2, 3, 4 pumps off, and then the center tank is going to provide fuel exclusively over here. Note that you do not have to turn the pumps off for using the center tank because the center tank pumps provide output at a higher pressure than the boost pumps of tanks 1, 2, 3 and 4. Alright, and that's the very easy thing for the flight engineers. So if you want to handle it manually, use the climb, as your engines have a very high fuel flow in the climb. Use that in order to start balancing your fuel as needed, or respectively burn fuel from the tanks as needed. Okay, and that's pretty much what we got in the back over here. Now, as we're climbing to higher altitudes, you will see the flight engineer is still keeping our engines in climb thrust, but you can see that we're eventually reaching a point in time where our airspeed is going to start decreasing. So make sure that you are on top of that and pitch the aircraft in order to maintain the 300 knots climb speed until you transition to Mach 80, and once you reach Mach 80, increase the pitch slightly in order to maintain a constant Mach number for the rest of the climb. Now, let's take a short moment over here to talk about anti-ice, because anti-ice is something that you will very likely encounter on many flights. So, the aircraft is anti-iced using either the engine nacelle anti-ice or the wing anti-ice. Now, when are you going to use what? Well, that's quite simple. The engine anti-ice or the nacelle anti-ice is basically used on a preemptive way. So we want to avoid ice from building on the engine nacelles at all. So just a little bit of a theory over here. Remember, the engine nacelles are the part at the very front of the engine. We de-ice those on a preemptive manner, because if ice was to build up over here, and if we would then heat them up to get rid of that ice, there are chances that part of the ice might fly into the fan, creating damage to the engine. Therefore, you basically always want to turn the nacelle anti-ice on before you're actually entering icing conditions. Now, what are icing conditions? Icing conditions exist when the outside temperature is plus 10 degrees or less, and there is visible moisture present. Now, visible moisture can be anything from fog, rain, clouds, snow, you name it. Your temperature gauge is located on the side over here. So you got the total air temperature located over here, and you got the static air temperature located down here. So what's interesting for us is the static air temperature for the plus 10 degree limit. Static air temperature, sorry, my correction, total air temperature is interesting for the plus 10 degree limit, and static air temperature is interesting for the minus 40 degree limit. What's the minus 40 about? When you're in climb or in cruise and you're encountering visible moisture, but the static air is at or below minus 40 degrees, then any moisture located in the clouds that you may be flying through is so deeply frozen that it is just going to bounce off your airplane. Therefore, anti-ice not required when you are operating at static air temperature of minus 40 degrees or below. So basically, engine anti-ice needed if the total air temperature is plus 10 degrees or less, and the static air temperature is minus 40 or more. Sounds complicated? It isn't that bad, believe me. Now, that's for the engine anti-ice. To use engine anti-ice, you basically want to select the cowling, then you turn on the nacelle anti-ice switches, and that's all you have to do. You can see you get the green light. Note that you do not get them if nose cowl selector is set to off. So make sure it's set somewhere here. Alright, that's the engine anti-ice. Now let's talk about wing anti-ice, because wing anti-ice is used in a different manner. Basically, the wing looks a little bit different when it comes to icing. The wing anti-ice heats up the leading edge of the wing. Now imagine that you're flying through icing conditions, you've got a hot leading edge, so the water hits the leading edge, which is hot. Then that water is going to flow backwards, but only the leading edge is heated. So the water could flow backwards and then freeze on the cold wing behind the leading edge. You do not want that because you are not going to be able to remove that ice from that wing any longer. Therefore, what you do is to use the wing anti-ice in a de-icing manner. So the engine anti-ice is used to prevent ice from building up on the wing. The wing anti-ice is used as a de-icer so that you remove ice that has already built up on the wing. The way you do this is you turn the wing anti-ice switch on. You can see that the duct temperature rises. So what the airplane is doing now is to take air from the engines, and it is going to redirect that hot bleed air into the leading edge of the wing. Now the leading edge heats up, and any ice that has already frozen on the leading edge is going to melt on its lower part, and the airflow from the air going over your wing is going to blow that ice off your wing. Therefore, use engine anti-ice before you enter an area of known icing. Use wing anti-ice only once ice has already started building up on your aircraft. How are you going to know that ice is building up on your wing? Well, you can either look at it, because you can actually see the wing from the flight deck, but it is fairly difficult to see if especially small layers of ice have built on the leading edge. Therefore, a much better cue for that is your wipers. So if ice starts to build up on the wipers, especially up here on that area where the wiper is attached to the airframe, that's where you're gonna see it first. And if ice is building up on those parts of the wipers, that's when you want to use wing anti-ice, turn it on, keep it on for a minute, so that any ice that exists on your airframe has the chance to melt and be blown off your wing. But thereafter turn the wing anti-ice back off, even if you're still in icing conditions. So basically, you want ice to build up, then you remove it again, then new ice builds up, then you remove it again, and that's how you fly, or that's how you use wing anti-ice in your flight. Alright, sounds fairly easy, believe me, it is. Alright, so we are now climbing. We've just passed 30,000 feet, and it is good practice to check your air conditioning and pressurization on the flight engineer's panel every 10,000 feet in the climb. So we can now see differential pressure is building. Our cabin altitude has reached 6,050 feet, which, as we can see down here, is more or less the altitude that we wanted to be at for our cruise. The cabin vertical speed is 0, and the differential pressure is building over here. So with that, easy going. Alright, moving back up into the front, we can see our Mach number has reached Mach 0.80. What we're going to do here is just a very slight pitch up, just like 1 or 2 clicks here on the pitch wheel, and that is all you need for the airplane to approximately maintain its Mach number. You will notice that your target speed is now decreasing, so the fast-slow selector basically becomes unusable for maintaining a constant Mach number until we are in level flight once again, which is normal and pretty much what we're expecting. Alright. So that's basically all there is to our climb procedure. And that's basically all we got to do for the time being. So we can take, a minute and a half until we reach our cruising level of flight level 340, just to sit back for a little bit, just enjoy the fantastic views over here, enjoy a fantastic look at our Boeing 707. Alright, we are approaching the target altitude. You can see the altitude alert light is coming on over there. Since we've selected pre-selector for our altitude selector mode, the airplane is automatically going to fly the level off at flight level 340. Had we not selected that, we would have to level off manually using the pitch thumb wheels, and once we are level at the target altitude, manually engage the altitude hold mode. Alright, so you can see altitude mode just came on in red, showing us that it's intercepting the altitude, and now it's leveling off, and now it is green, showing us that it is maintaining the altitude. So, let's turn altitude hold on the flight director modes as well, like that, and remember, you do not have an auto throttle, so we gotta fly our cruise Mach number manually. What I would recommend to do here is keep the engines on climb thrust until you reach the target Mach number, which is A2 for us. Then dial the speed box so that the fast slow selector is exactly in the middle, and only then we are going to set our cruise power. Now, the exact EPR you need to maintain your Mach number is something that you gotta find out about with a little bit of trial and error. But what I would recommend to do is to initially go to an EPR of about 1.6, maybe a little bit less than that, and then see how your Mach number develops. You only have to maintain the Mach number within plus minus 0.02, so if your target cruise Mach is 0.82, then you can fly anywhere between 80 and 84. And only when you deviate from that, that's when you would have to advise air traffic control. Alright, so you can see about 1.6 EPR, seems to work fairly well here, the plane is maintaining the speed nicely, and with that we are in level flight. Now, reaching level flight is where the paperwork starts. You do not have any fancy FMC telling you where you are going, so what we are going to have to do is some manual paperwork here. So let's open our flight plan, find our top of climb, and then we are going to write down a couple things. So we're going to start with the time where we reach our top of climb. We can see down here it's exactly 0600. Then we want the fuel. And we're going to get that from the flight engineers panel down here. Total fuel quantity 39. So we got 39,000 pounds of fuel on board. So let's go ahead and enter that down here. So 39.0. And finally we need the fuel used, respectively the fuel burned, and that is available from down here. So we burned 2,380 pounds per engine, so roughly 2,400. So that's 9.6. So we burned 9,600 pounds of fuel. So going down here, we can enter that in our plan. Here we go, 9.6, and that's our flight plan filled in. Next, you're going to enter the actual takeoff time, and then using the estimated en route times, you're going to calculate the expected time over at any waypoint. Doing that, you have the possibility to judge whether you are early or late, and it's going to be easy to calculate the estimated time of arrival simply based on your actual time, so 24 minutes in the air, 0600, and then we can just scroll down, 1 hour and 36 flight time minus 24 minutes, so we're looking at 1 hour and 12 on top of this, so we have an estimated time of arrival of 0712 UTC. Well, and that's what you do at the top of climb, and then you do the same thing whenever you're overflying a waypoint. So let's rotate the INS to the distance and time selector, and we can see it's 77 nautical miles, respectively 8.9 minutes, to the next waypoint. So when we reach that waypoint, which is going to be number 7, then we can do another fuel check. Number 7 is at book, as we can see over here, so that's how we are going to navigate this. Now, let's have another look into the INS and some of the en route stuff that we need to do with the INS. So what we are going to do here with the INS is to constantly monitor its navigational accuracy. We can see that down here. If you go to the desired track/status page, you get those numbers on the right. The 5 indicates the mode in which the INS is operating, which is currently unguided or unaided mode, and the 3 gives us our accuracy index. Now this index, basically 0, 1, 2, 3, indicates a high accuracy. 4 or 5 is an accuracy where you may want to consider aiding the INS in its position, and anything from 6 or higher indicates that you should consider a position update. The INS is basically constantly going to drift. That's because it's based on gimbals, and the gimbals have a little bit of friction. They basically aren't 100% accurate. So what we're going to do here is that we have to correct that INS drift through the course of our flight. Now, the INS isn't dumb. It has a mode available in which it can correct itself, and I want to talk about that right now. There are 2 ways that you can use to correct an INS position. The first is if you have a known location. So for example, if you're flying over a VOR like the Jaipur VOR up there, 112.9, let's go ahead and dial that in. So 112.9, that's in here now. We've already passed that VOR, so that is not gonna be all that helpful for us any longer. But if this would be a station that would be ahead of our flight, on our flight plan, then instead of navigating on the INS, you could navigate with the VOR. So basically just dial the desired track in that you are supposed to have on your airway, and then once you are over the VOR, you can update the position by going into the position page, clicking the hold button, and that's gonna freeze the current position. Then you enter your position just like if you would have entered any waypoint. And once the position is entered and inserted, the INS immediately updates itself to that position. So that's one way of doing this, and that's a very useful way if you are overflying a known location. So basically if you're overflying any VOR. Now, we are not going to overfly any more VOR for the foreseeable future on our flight. And see that scrolling down all the way to our destination. There's an NDB along our way. That's not really going to help us. So what else can we do? Well, we can use any VOR located in the en route environment around us. So here's our route of flight. We're currently inbound to Atburg. So next to Atburg, there are a couple of VORs along our route over here. We got that one, we got that one, we got that one. So let's go ahead and dial one of those up. Like for example this one, Udaipur 115.9. When you click on there in the Navigraph app, you can actually get more information about that. Provided that there isn't an airport beneath it, let's just go on to the details. Here we go. Udaipur VOR, let's please select that thing. Uniform Delta. Come on. I want the VOR, not the airport. Okay, it doesn't want to open it. There's another way to do this. You can go onto the search field. It's Uniform Delta, Udaipur. So search, Uniform Delta, Udaipur. That's it. So, clicking onto the VOR, we're going to get all the data we need. So, what are we going to do up next? First of all, let's tune the station and verify that it's actually giving us sensible information. So, why did this go back to the airport? No, I want the VOR. Here we go. Here we go. Alright, so frequency is 115.9. Let's go ahead and tune that. Alright, we can now see we are receiving the VOR, and we're also receiving the associated DME. We can verify that this is indicating useful stuff, so that way we can verify that the location is actually correct, or that the VOR is correctly working. Now, we know the position of that VOR because it's down here in our coordinates. We also know the elevation of that thing, 1,709 feet. So let's go ahead and tell the INS to use that known location in order to update its own position. How are we going to do that? So, we are going to start with the selector on the waypoint position. Now, we press switch number 7, which is the LL switch. Pressing that, you can see a couple of things happening. We get all zeros in the position, and we get the number 0 flashing down there. First of all, we want to change that. Number 0 should always be reserved, so don't use 0. Waypoint change, 1, insert. Now number 1 is flashing. We got 3 different slots where we can program a known VOR DME location into the INS. So, we're programming slot number 1 right now. So let's give it the coordinates, 2436.5. So, north 2436.5, and double check that this is absolutely correct before you enter this. If you enter a wrong coordinate, you're going to screw your entire INS alignment, and you will basically have to rely on a ground-based nav aid to gain your position back. So, we got that one. 2436.5, 2436.5. Insert. Now let's go for the east coordinate. That one is 7353, we can round this, 0.4. So, 7353.4. Verified. Okay, insert. With that, we have defined the position of our VOR. Now let's go button number 3, which is frequency. This is going to open 2 things, the left side and the right side. The left side is used to define the elevation of that VOR. The system needs it because, remember, this is always the slant range, so the range from the airplane to the station. It is not the horizontal distance. So we need to know the elevation of the station. Down here we can see the DME elevation is 1,709 feet. We can only program thousands, so we're going to use the nearest 1,000, which is 2. So click number 2 in order to start entering in that field, and then enter 2. Now, this indicates 2,000 feet elevation, insert. Now, we click the east or west button, and this opens the right hand side, where we enter the frequency of that VOR. So, 115.9. Type the full frequency, 11590, and disregard those symbols down there. We need the full frequency. Press insert, and with that we have now defined a VOR in our INS. What we do now is we go down to desired track / status. Over here we can see our operating mode, which is number 5. Let's change that to aided navigation, which is number 4. So we enter this, hit insert. Now we can see number 4 is active over there. What's happening now is that our airplane is automatically using that VOR, and it's automatically tuning it as well. The INS has its own nav radio. You don't see that, but it has its own nav radio, and it's now tracking that VOR and using it in order to automatically correct its position, because it now has a radio and a distance, so it can use that to update its position. What I would strongly recommend to do after you've entered this mode is that you go back to distance time and you monitor the distance to the next waypoint. What's very important over here is that you do not notice any large runaways on that location. If that thing starts running away, immediately change over to heading mode, because then you've done something wrong when defining that ground-based navigation aid, and that means that the position of the INS is now running away. So be very careful with that. Now as we're flying along, you can see we're already heading towards waypoint number 8, and number 9 is going to be very near behind that. So what we want to do is to enter the next bunch of waypoints that we need for our flight. So let's go ahead and open our flight plan again and start programming the next waypoints along our route. you can see Agrix as number 9 was the last one we defined, so Beacon is going to be the next waypoint that we will define. Let's go ahead and open that EFB as a 2D panel over here to make it a little easier. And now let's go ahead and start programming. So we go back to the waypoint selector. Once the INS overflies waypoint number 9, it's automatically going to continue navigating to waypoint number 1. So let's go ahead and type the next waypoint in down there. So we need Beacon at 2237.9. So we select waypoint number 1, north 2237.9, insert east 74080. Insert. With that, waypoint number 1 is defined as Beacon. So next is going to be Songra NDB. So let's select number 2. Edit 21086. And east 73335. Insert. Next up, number 3. Active 2049. And 7315.5. Insert. Next up, number 4, IPGAN, and that's 20028. And east 73117. Insert. Number 5, waypoint 395, 1931.1. And east 73090. And that way we can now enter all the rest of our waypoints. Now, we've just overflown waypoint number 8. That was Agupa. So let's do a very quick fuel check down here. We've overflown Agupa at time 15. Well, let's go ahead and enter that down here. Time 15. And then let's see about our fuel. So we got, what's that? 30,000 pounds roughly. Yeah, call it 31,000. So Agupa 31.0. And the fuel used down here 3,200, so that's 3, 6, 9, 12, 12,800 pounds used. Alright, so we can see we are saving a little bit of fuel over here, and like that we're keeping track of our flight's progress. Okay, and that way we can now do our fuel checks, we can keep our INS up to date, and I'm just quickly going to finish that process. So we have programmed waypoint number 5. Let's continue with waypoint number 6. And let's also fill that stuff in on the flight plan. So Beacon is number 1. Then we got that NDB down here as number 2. Then we got active as number 3. We got IPGAN as number 4, and we got waypoint 392 as number 5. So next is going to be MROS as number 6. So select that, and then we got 1912.7. Insert, and the east coordinate 73086. Insert. Alright, so here's waypoint number 6. Finally, we can enter waypoint number 7. Never override the waypoints that are currently in use. So number 7 down here is going to be Olgus, and that's going to be 1912.9. And 7328.4. Insert. Alright, so waypoint number 9 is also, number 7 is also entered. Again, do not override the waypoints that are currently in use, otherwise your airplane is going to turn somewhere where you absolutely don't want to go. We can monitor the navigational status over here. We can see the accuracy index is still at number 3, so the airplane is keeping it up to date as we are cruising along. Now, During the cruise, there are a couple more things that we can do up here. First of all, let's take a very quick second look at the Flight Engineers panel. In the climb, I have briefly touched on the fuel and its balancing. Now, if you are using the automated flight engineer with the automated fuel balancing, then all of that is going to be done automatically by the flight engineer. But you can do that manually. So let's just take a look into some typical settings that you may want to use for your fuel over here. If you're taking your 707 on a long-haul flight, where the tanks number 1, 2, 3 and 4 are completely filled, and there is fuel in the center tank, then you would start... Why is he opening that valve? There's no reason to open that valve. Let's just turn that automated fuel monitoring off for a second. So, flight engineer, fuel feeding. Let's just turn that off for now. Alright, so this would be your standard setup that you came from during the takeoff. You can see tank number 1 is feeding engine number 1, tank number 2, engine number 2, and so on. You cannot pump fuel from one tank into the other. All you can do is to burn fuel from a selected tank. So, if you are departing for a long haul, then your center tank fuel is the fuel that you want to burn first. How do you do that? You turn all the 4 cross-feed valves on. You turn the center tank pumps on, and the center tank pumps deliver a higher pressure than the tanks number 1 through 4. Therefore, the center tank fuel is going to be burned even if you leave those fuel pumps on. Eventually, you're going to reach a point where the center tank runs dry. You will notice that because the low pressure lights are going to start flickering. When you reach that point, ensure that the fuel pumps on the other tanks are on, and then you can turn the fuel pumps for the main tanks off. The next configuration that you're going to find yourself in is the tanks number 2 and 3 carry more fuel than the tanks number 1 and 4. Note that you do have reserve tanks down here, which can transfer their fuel into the tanks number 1 and 4, so you may want to open those valves down here in order to transfer that fuel into those tanks. Now, let's go ahead and close those again. Next up, we want to burn the fuel from the tanks number 2 and 3 so that the tanks 2 and 3 reach an equal level to the tanks 1 and 4. Remember, tanks 2 and 3 are the tanks that are located on the inner part of the wing over here, so they contain more fuel than the tanks on the outer part of the wing. So what we're going to do here is that we are going to transfer fuel, or rather we are going to burn all engines from the tanks number 2 and 3. The way you do this is as follows. First of all, make sure that the cross-feed valves are open. Do never turn a boost pump off unless the required cross-feeds are open. Always check that first. You don't want to kill your engines in flight, do you? So, what are we going to do next? Ensure that the boost pumps for tanks number 2 and 3 are turned on, and ensure that the cross-feed valves are open. Then, and only then, turn off the boost pumps for tanks number 1 and tanks number 4. Like this. Now, fuel is fed from the boost pump up here, following the diagram down here through the crossfeed, up here to engine number 1, and the same happens on this side to engine number 4. That way we are now exclusively burning fuel from tanks number 2 and 3. You want to do this until the fuel quantity in tanks 2 and 3 becomes equal to the quantities in tanks number 1 and 4, taking any fuel in the reserve tanks into account. Once you reach that, turn on the boost pumps for tanks number 1 and 4, and only then, after you've verified that all the boost pumps are on, you can now close the crossfeed valves for the remaining, or you can now close all the crossfeed valves, and now that you've got an equal amount of fuel in each of the tanks that are feeding each of their associated standard engines, only now we are going to keep the boost pumps on with the crossfeed valves closed. And that's the fuel management that the flight engineer can automate for you when you've got the automatic monitoring fuel feed turned on. Now, next up, fuel temperature. As you're flying at high altitudes, your fuel is eventually going to start cooling. You can nicely see that here. If you go to the number 1 tank, you can see the fuel is now at about 17 degrees. We did start with the fuel at 30 degrees because on the ground the hot air around the wings heated the fuel up. Now the fuel is eventually going to start cooling. The minimum acceptable fuel temperature is minus 44 degrees when using Jet A1 fuel and minus 37 degrees when using Jet A fuel. You need to keep your fuel temperatures above that. What you can do is to manually turn on the fuel heaters down there. Latest do that when the icing lights come on. Again, this is automated through the automatic flight engineer, but if you're not using him, then if the fuel temperatures are approaching those limits, so minus 37 for Jet A fuel, basically departing the USA, minus 44 departing anywhere else in the world, then you want to turn the fuel heaters on. What that does is to route fuel through a fuel oil heat exchanger where the hot engine oil is routed through very thin pipes next to the fuel. That way the hot temperatures from the oil can transfer into the fuel and warm fuel is going to return into the tanks. That way you can heat your fuel up should that become desired. Now, we've done that. So let's go ahead and have a look at the air conditioning. At any given point in time, 2 air compressors should be in use. The third one should be turned off. By default, number 2 and 3 are going to be on, and that's how the air is controlled. You can see over here that engine bleed air is not necessarily taken. Instead, we've got the air conditioning units running through the wing valve and the air compressors, and that is what's feeding our airplane. Bleed air can be taken, but it's not normally required. And that way you can monitor your temperatures over here. You can see we got the nice 75 degrees Fahrenheit that we're commanding. The inlet duct is a little bit warmer. And that way our airplane is now getting climatized through our flight. That's the basic tasks of the flight engineer as we are flying along. As you can see, all fairly easy. For us, the main task is to keep our airplane on our track, keep it at our or around our Mach number. As you can see, we're flying Mach 8.4 right now. So we are going to correct that by making a very small input to our throttles, like this. You can see I've barely reduced my EPR. So the one thing we do not want in cruise is large changes. Instead, very small change, watch how the speed is reacting, and that's how you control your airspeed in the cruise. About as easy as that. Don't do anything more than what you absolutely have to do. Small changes are all it needs. Don't do large changes because you're only going to destabilize yourself. The airplane is a fairly stable platform. Don't change that by raping the controls. One of the most important lessons that you will ever have to learn as a student pilot. Do not rape the controls. Do as minimal of an input as is absolutely required. Well, you can see the Mach number is slowly coming back now. Now we're at 8.3. Once we're at 8.2, we can increase the thrust ever so slightly, should that even be needed. We'll see where the plane is going to stabilize. And that's how we're flying along. That's how we're monitoring our position. Now we've just left the range of that VOR. So let's go back here onto distance and status. And now we are going to activate mode number 5, which is the unaided navigation mode. So now our INS is drifting again. We could go to the en route charts and find another VOR along our route. So we've been using that one. We could go somewhere down here, like that one, Quebec, Quebec, Zulu, and program that. So let's go ahead and have a look. That's 117.3, Vadodara. Let's go ahead and tune that. Here's 117.3. Look at that, we are receiving the station over there on our right hand side. So we could now go ahead and reprogram that same station the exact same way that we used to do it earlier. So let's go ahead and have a look at that. That's Quebec, Quebec, Zulu. Let's search that. Vadodara, there it is. So let's select that. Here's our VOR. So again, let's go ahead and program that. We go to waypoint. We go to LL, like that. We want to program waypoint number 1 again. Let's insert that. Now, the coordinates 2219.6. Insert, and the east coordinates 7313.3. And that is cross-checked. Okay, so insert that. Now go onto frequency. We start by pressing the N key to enter the elevation, which we can see as more or less 0. We round it to the nearest 1000. We're going to enter 0 over there, insert, and now pressing the W key we can enter the frequency, which is 117.3. Insert. Now that we've programmed that point, let's go to track status, enter mode number 4, insert, and now the INS is once again operating in a guided mode. Monitor the distance to the next waypoint after you've activated this mode, so that your airplane doesn't suddenly start drifting off track because you've done an incorrect entry. So always do monitor that as you fly along. Well, and with that, we can go ahead and talk about our descent preparation. So the first thing we need to know, of course, is the runway in use, and for that, what you would do in the real 707 is to listen to the Volmat. Don't have that available in the simulator, so what we are going to do is simply to have a look into our destination airport. Here we go, Mumbai. Let's select that. Weather 24087, 3500 meters visibility, 28 degrees, QNH 1006, temporary 1500 meters visibility and showers of rain. Alright, so with that we can use runway 27 over in Mumbai. So let's go ahead and find our particulars for that route. Starting with our arrival, we've got the IGBAT to Alpha arrival. So let's go back into the Navigraph charts. IGBAN to Alpha, here it is, and that thing is pinned. Then let's go down here and select the ILS Zulu approach for runway 27, pin that one as well. And lastly, we have the airport chart, and we also want our parking stand charts. Now that we got all of those pinned, let's start with a look into the arrival. So, basically, what we want to define is an end of descent waypoint, and then we're going to take that and calculate backwards from that end of descent point. How are we going to do that? So, basically the first thing I would do is to cross-check the star. Like, how many track modes do I have? Is there terrain around? What do I have? So, we've got MROS in flight level 80, which is a fixed altitude that we have to reach. Now, what are we going to do in order to calculate our descent? We take the basic 3-2-1 rule. So, for every 1,000 feet of altitude, we are going to need 3 nautical miles. So we're going to calculate this backwards. From MROS, we got 18 miles to Mike Bravo 392. That one has a flight level 100 restriction associated with it. So we got a little problem, because MROS, 18 miles, would be 6,000 feet. So we could cross that waypoint in 14,000 on a standard 3-degree descent. But since we got a level 100 below restriction, that is kind of overriding it. So waypoint 392 should be at flight level 100. Now, that thing also has a 230 knot restriction. So we got to slow our airplane down, reaching that waypoint. So what are we going to do? Basically, our descent speed is going to be 300 knots. We are going to lose 10 knots per nautical mile in level flight. So what we're going to do is this. We reach flight level 100 7 miles prior to this waypoint, in order to do a level deceleration segment from 300 knots descent speed to the 230 knots that are defined over here. So 7 miles prior waypoint 392, we need to reach flight level 100. Let's go ahead and write that down. I'm going to take a little notepad over here. And then we've got MROS slash minus 7 flight level 100. Speed reduction 230 at MROS. Alright, so that's the point from which on we're going to base our entire descent now. So let's go ahead and have a look. The next waypoint prior to MROS is 31.7 miles, IPGAN, at 250 above level 120. Let's ignore the 250 because it's just gonna take too long. ATC is very likely to waive that restriction anyway. So, we basically have 32 miles here. Let's subtract the 7 miles prior to which we want to reach level 100. So that leaves us with 32 minus 7, 25 miles. So now, 25 divided by 3 means we have approximately 7,000 feet that we can lose on that segment over here. So, level 100 plus 7,000 means flight level 170 overhead ICBAN. So let's go back down to our notepad and write down ICBAN. What am I doing here? So, ICBAN. Why are my controls not disabled? ICBAN slash... Don't move my point of view around. FL170. Alright. The camera is doing strange things here. I've just written down ICBAN, flight level 170, speed 300. Like that. Alright. So, now we've got that. So let's move back into our star chart and see. Next is going to be 12.6 miles. Let's take 12 divided by 4, so we're going to cross active in flight level... Oh, I didn't mean to toggle active pause. That's what happened when I typed something down there. So we want to cross active 4,000 feet above ICBAN. ICBAN is 170, so active is level 210. Let's go right back down into the notepad. So active slash FL210 and 300 knots. Now that's the point from which we enter the star, so the rest of it has to be taken straight from the flight plan here. So 56 miles between active and Sonogar. So let's see, we're in level 210 at active, and we're cruising in flight level 340. That means we need to cover 13,000 feet to get down to active. So 13,000 feet, 13 times 3 is 39 miles. That means our top of descent is located 39 miles prior to active. Let's go back down. So TD, active slash minus 39. And that's it. That's our descent calculation done. So let's see. If we look at the flight plan, active is waypoint number 3. And we're inbound to active, 55 miles to go. So, when we've got 39 miles down here, that's our top of descent. That's as easy as it is. Now, for the purpose of this tutorial, I have only done this calculation now, approaching the top of descent. for any practical flight, I would recommend this to be the first thing you do when you reach the top of climb, so that you have an idea when you're going to have to start your descent. Make sense? Hope so. Alright, cool. So that's that. Now, approaching our top of descent, there's a couple of things that we need to prepare. Let's have a look for the landing field elevation, which is 23 feet over here. Once we start descending, we need to dial our field elevation into the cabin pressure computer. Only do that when you actually start descending, but have the figure ready so that there is no delay by the time that you start going down. Apart from that, we can already go down into the 707 app, onto the data card, and we can go onto the landing page, select our landing field elevation, which is 23 feet, and then we can select our landing flap setting, 40 for most cases, and press the set box button. This is going to set all your approach box, but note that this resets your target speed, so make sure to keep that one exactly where you want it, and reset it as necessary. Alright, we're now reaching our top of descent. Remember, 39 miles prior to active. So, when the altitude, or when we reach that distance, dial down the altitude, disable altitude hold mode, and then just dial the pitch wheel into the down position. How many feet per minute do we need? Well, we calculated a standard 3-degree profile, so let's just go down to the ground speed tab on the INS. We're doing 500 knots ground speed, so 500 times 3, 2,500 feet a minute. So let's adjust our pitch so that we obtain 2,500 feet a minute for a rate of descent. Remember, you don't have auto throttle, so once you reach your target speed, reduce your thrust as necessary in order to maintain that speed. If you put the speed bug to 300, you now only need to keep that thing in the middle, and that's how you can maintain your speed precisely. Leaving our cruising altitude, let's go to the Flight Engineers panel, and this is the one thing you need to do manually here, because the Flight Engineer doesn't know your landing field elevation. So, here's your field elevation. On the right hand side, dial that thing down to your field elevation, so basically down to 20 feet for us today. Make sure the mode selector is on landing, and all the rest is once again going to happen automatically, so nothing we need to worry about. Instead, what we are going to do during our descent is to monitor our descent's progress. So, how are we going to do that? Well, we got the distance and the time to the different waypoints. We also have calculated the crossing altitudes for those waypoints. So let's go down to the notepad. And let's just dial the target altitude like all the way down. Give me level 100, please. Like that. Alright, so we want to cross active in flight level 210. So what can we do to monitor that? We know the time to active, 3 minutes. We know our rate of descent, 2,500 feet per minute. We're in 29,500. 3 minutes for the descent, so that's 7,500 feet a minute. So we're going to reach approximately 22,000 feet by the waypoint active. In other words, we need to increase our rate of descent ever so slightly so that we get to active at the time where we actually want to be there. There is another way you can do this. You know your time, let's say 2 minutes. We're in 28,000 feet, we want to reach 21,000 feet. That means we need to lose 7,000 feet. 7,000 feet over 2 minutes, 3,500 feet a minute. So let's dial that thing down a little bit. And down we go. That's about as easy as it gets. Now something you need to remember, flying the 707 in your descent, is to keep the tilt of the weather radar under control. You can see if you tilt it above, you're not going to see anything. Normally something about 1 or 2 degrees downwards is a good tilt for the flight. We can actually see a little bit of weather along our flight here, but doesn't look like anything significant, so we can just disregard that for the time being, and instead we will focus on descending our airplane. Thrust management in the descent, again, just like in cruise, you do small inputs, you mostly fly with a constant thrust setting, and you know if the speed is off by a couple knots, who cares? If you look at the fast-slow indicator, the line above and below the middle indicate 10 knots. So hey, our target is set to 300. If we fly 310, is that a problem? Well, if ATC instructs the speed, you may want to fly it a little more precisely. But the important thing here is that you're only going to do small inputs for your corrections. So as we're descending, we need to turn on the fasten seatbelt sign at some point, and my recommendation is to either turn it on at the top of descent, or turn it on at 15 minutes or 15,000 feet prior to landing. That way, you have a constant SOP, and whenever you are carrying out one of the actions, either starting the descent or passing 15,000, you basically always think about, oh, alright, I need to turn on the fasten seatbelt sign. Today, since we are expecting a little bit of weather ahead of us, let's go ahead and turn them on a little bit earlier, just so that we are prepared for reaching that point in time. Now, we have just crossed active. We're in 22,000 feet, so a little higher than usual. Let's see what our current ground speed is. 447. So if we maintain 3,000 feet a minute, we should be closing in on our path. So let's see. We're inbound to Igben now, which we should cross at flight level 170. Distance and time tells us it's 1 minute. To reach flight level 170, we're basically in 20,000, so at 3,000 feet a minute we are going to return onto the descent path that we're actually looking for. Easy, isn't it? During the descent, be careful. If you do pull your throttles all the way to idle, you're gonna get the landing gear warning, so just keep that in mind while you're descending. So we've just lost our VOR that we've been using for the position update, so let's go into the status page here, enable mode number 5, that way the INS is now once again relying on its internal references. Alright, so the new track is 184 degrees, and that is selected. And we're just monitoring our descent progress over here. We have just crossed Igben, basically just above level 170, so our vertical profile is still looking good. And now we want to reach flight level 100, 7 miles prior to MROS, so that we can reduce our speed. We've got 4.5 minutes. We're descending at roughly 2,500 feet a minute, so it's going to take us 3 minutes to get down. That leaves us 1.5 minutes to reduce our speed. In other words, we're flying a fairly good profile. Let's take a quick moment to talk about anti-ice in the descent. I told you during the climb that we need to turn the nacelle anti-ice on if the total air temperature is below +10 and the static air above -40. In the descent, the static air constraint is completely removed. The reason is that the static air gets warmer during the descent, so in order for you not to forget to turn on the nacelle anti-ice, we are always going to turn the nacelle anti-ice on if we're descending. The total air temperature is +10 degrees or lower, and there is visible moisture, which could be clouds, rain, snow, virgas, anything. Alright. So we're flying a little fast right now, but we are also descending a little quicker than planned, reaching level 100 a little earlier than planned. That way we don't need to use our speed brake, but we can simply follow the target that we have set ourselves. So, at some point during the descent, we need to start setting up for the approach. So, let's tune Mumbai VOR 16.6 on the second set. And you can see we are already receiving that, and we now know that Mumbai is 50 nautical miles in front of us. We're passing 12,000 feet. So, a quick calculation in our heads here tells us 12 times 3, 36, plus doing 130 knots, so we need 13 miles to reduce the speed, so we need 45 miles. 49 miles out, so we're actually at a pretty good altitude. Now over here, a little bit of weather comes up, and that's what we can see down here on our radar as well. So we could start avoiding, but for the purpose of the tutorial, let's not do that. We're reaching 1,000 to go, so let's reduce our vertical speed a little bit. We have 16 miles to run to the target waypoint. So what we want to do now is, I want to keep the 300 knots, I want to level the airplane off, and then 7 miles prior to that waypoint, we want to reduce our thrust basically to idle, just outside of the landing gear warning range, and then let's see how well our formula has actually worked. So we're maintaining the 300 knots over here. We're going to level off in a moment. And then 7 miles prior to the waypoint, we will go to idle thrust and start our speed reduction. Well, let's see how well that's gonna work. Remember, over the waypoint, we want to reach a speed of 230 knots. So, we're flying 300 right now. Let me lower that thing down to 230. And once we see the 7 over here. So, now, idle. That was the landing gear warning, by the way. You can cut that out down here if you want to. Alright, and now we start our deceleration. And basically, by the time we reach the waypoint, so by the time we reach Mike Bravo 392, we should have achieved 230 knots. At the higher speeds, the deceleration goes a little bit quicker, because we have more drag, and the slower we get, the slower the airplane is going to slow down. Alright, so after waypoint 392, we have 18 miles to descend to flight level 80 for the waypoint MROS. So it's sequencing the waypoint, but it's always doing that a little early. So let's reduce the speed. You can see we got 250 now, aiming for 230, and once we reach that, we are continuing the descent to 80, like this. Okay, so we got MROS and Olgus. Just a very quick check to make sure that I've got Olgus as number 7. Perfect. Alright. And here we go, reaching 230 knots. Let's continue our descent. So alt-hold comes off, pitch down a bit. The 707 is not an airplane that descends very well. In fact, you will see that even now, idle thrust, 1,000 feet a minute, the speed is gradually going to start increasing. So be prepared to use the speed brake as needed during your descents. Alright, and that way we're now going down to flight level 80. As we're passing through level 100, we can turn the landing lights on, we can turn our turn off and our taxi lights on, and we verify that the fasten seatbelt signs are on, and lastly we move to the flight engineers panel, and we verify that the cabin altitude is coming down nicely. Differential pressure about 4.0 when going through level 100 is normally a good figure, obviously adjusted for airfield elevation. So if you're flying in a high field, then you want to take that reading at 10,000 above the field. Okay. So we're nicely on our descent. So let's go ahead and talk about our approach setup. Once we're reaching that next waypoint, which is MROS, we're going to turn into the downwind, and then we will basically receive radar vectors onto the final. So let's go ahead and start our setup of the approach. You will usually do that pretty late in the 707 because we do need our nav radios and we don't have standby frequencies or stuff, and we usually need them for our descent. So let's see, Mumbai, weather, QNH, 1007. So let's go ahead and select 1007. And that is set. Then let's have a look at our ILS. Frequency 110.3. Let's go ahead and tune that in the VHF 1 radio. And the final approach course is 270. So let's tune that down here. 270. Alright, the minimum for the approach is 230 feet, and that equals 207 feet on the radio altimeter. The 707 can only give you calls based on the radio altimeter, so let's select 207 down here. So basically like that, 220 nearest works fairly well. Alright, we are leveling off. Remember to add thrust. Here we go, 6 miles prior to the waypoint. Do not target continuous descent approaches and stuff like that. That really wasn't a thing back in the day. I mean, nice for you for trying, but flying an airplane that basically pulls these huge black plumes of exhaust behind it, we don't really need to worry about the environment.
220 knots, set west.
Alright, that's a little bit early. We are going to maintain the 230. Now, we will talk about the deceleration technique in a few moments over here, but let me just give you a little overview of how you can kind of vector yourself in a conventional airplane. You will notice that many stars in the modern world are going to lead you into a downwind, and then it's up to air traffic control to vector you to the final. But if there is no air traffic control online, then you kind of want to be able to vector yourselves. So what I will always do, the majority of airports still have a field VOR, just like Mumbai has its VOR down there. Tune that on the second set. The reason you want to tune it on the second is so that the autopilot is capable of using your primary set for the ILS later on. Now, what we want to do is we monitor the position of that Mumbai VOR and the distance to that Mumbai VOR. We're in 8,000, and looking at our chart, there isn't any minimum altitude given, but 6,000 is the MSA here, 3,800 here, so let's go down to 6,000. Then 6,000 selected, let's continue our descent. We're now flying away from the field, and we're aiming for an altitude of 6,000. Once we are at those 6,000, we basically want to check our distance to the field, which is 6,000 times 3, so 6 times 3, 18 miles. We'll reach 18 DME from Mumbai on the downwind at 6,000. That would be a good point to start descending. That's just a little bit of a background there of how you could manage your descent in the 707 if you do not have any ATC present. Another way to do this is that you simply look at the glide slope. When you've got the ILS tuned on your primaries and the glide slope goes through, that's normally a good point to start descending. That's normally a pretty good point to start descending. Alright, so let's see. We're 23 miles out. We're in 7,000. So that looks like a good moment in time. So let's go ahead and switch to heading mode and start our final turn over here. Or rather start our base turn first. So heading 180, we're somewhere over here. Heading 180, we can ascend to 4,000 at this altitude. So let's set the altitude down. Here we go, 4,000. Then let's switch over to the ILS chart. So, what we are going to do here is 270 is going to be our final track. So we'll turn onto a 30-degree intercept course, which means 240 is our target heading. Now it looks like due to a little bit of INS drift and that type of stuff, we are already crossing the localizer now. So let's go ahead and switch this further to a heading of 300 for the intercept. And let's also keep our speed under control here. Speed brakes out. You can see the speed brakes are super effective in the 707. Let's start slowing down. We're about 25 miles out, so let's keep the 230 that we had from our start. Let's also turn the flight directors off, because I don't want to adjust several things at once. Okay, so now it's showing that we're left off track again, and the VOR is actually showing that as well. So let's maintain the 240 degrees. Like this. So here's the mountains that we see over here. So we gotta level off in 4,000. Alright, speed brakes back up again. And now what we are gonna do is to arm Vorlog mode on the autopilot so that the plane automatically intercepts the localizer as soon as it comes in. We are receiving the DME. At this point we would also listen to the audio and acoustically identify the signal. Remember, that's what you got the Morse code for down here. And now the localizer should basically start coming in at like any given point in time. By the way, make sure that the mode selector down here is set to localizer VOR, otherwise you're not going to get good data. So that's just something that you want to keep in mind. Alright, let's talk about when to slow down for our approach. So we are currently flying 230, and in normal approaches you would fly about 250. Basically, you need 1 mile per 10 knots to slow down prior to the glide slope intercept. So for our practical terms over here, that means that in order to intercept the glide slope from 4,000 feet, we will intercept in 12 miles. Again, yeah, you can disregard that, a little bit oversensitive, but then again, we are overflying the terrain down here, so yeah, it kind of makes sense that it is giving us a message there. Alright, so again, we want to slow the airplane down based on our altitude and our distance. So we know that at an altitude of 4,000 feet, we're gonna intercept and slow down in 12 nautical, or we're gonna intercept the glide in 12 nautical miles. So we're currently flying 210, and that is enough to get the flaps out. You want the flaps out by the time you intercept the glide, otherwise things are not gonna work out. So we have localizer intercept now. The glide slope is gonna come alive soon, so let's go flaps 14 and start slowing down. Alright, we can see the glide slope coming alive, so let's select the autopilot into glide slope auto, and that way it is going to automatically intercept and follow the glide slope. Now let's slow down to approximately 180 knots. And the 707 has so much idle thrust that you want to extend the landing gear by the time that you intercept the glide slope. Otherwise, you are not going to be able to slow the airplane down. The speed brake itself may not be sufficient there. So,
195 knots, set flaps 25.
Flaps 25. And then we're intercepting the glide slope just now. So let's go gear down. And then we can adjust the thrust manually for basically whatever speed we want to fly. Something like 180 or 170 or so to 5 miles. Usually works pretty well, also without making ATC angry. Alright. So, we have now intercepted the glide slope. The first officer has already said that as we're passing 195 knots, 165 knots, we could go for the landing flaps. Not gonna do that just yet. We will wait until we are at 6 nautical miles, and then we are going to configure the airplane for the final approach. As we intercept the glide slope, set the go-around altitude, which is 3,800 feet over here. Like that. And with that, we are nicely stabilized on the ILS approach. I do recommend that you use the autopilot for your first couple of approaches, just so that you see how the airplane behaves and what kind of settings you need to make at what time. It's really a lot more comfortable to get used to the aircraft using the autopilot. You can also put the flight director into GS Auto. That way you are getting flight director guidance here if you want to fly the approach manually. And well, for now, we got a crossing altitude of 1210 at 5 DME. Oh, sorry, 1630. And at 4 DME, we cross-check 1300 on the ILS. So that's for the localizer, that's for the ILS. You want to do that check, because that way you can determine if the glide slope is accurate or not. So that's a fairly important thing to do on older aircraft like that one. If you do have an auto marker, which was traditionally at 4 miles, that's why you would do the check. In the modern world, without marker beacons, we are going to do it at the distance given in the chart. Alright. So we're reaching 6 nautical miles. Let's slow down to the final approach speed. Let's just get that from down here again. Alright, so flaps 40, set the speed box, that sets our target speed. Like that, very nice. Okay, and once we're below 165, which as you can see down here, is not the speed limit, but the recommended speed. Let's go flaps 40. Remember to add thrust early on, because when the engines are in idle, they do need quite a while to spool up. And that way we can stabilize nice and early, like this. Alright, complete the landing checklist, which is basically gear down, flaps full, lights on, and seatbelt signs on. So, reaching 4 DME, basically now we are in 1300, just like we should be, so our glide slope is working. Reaching 1000 feet, I would recommend to always use the 1000 foot gate here. We want to be all stabilized. Now, being stabilized means that you are at an appropriate pitch and bank angle. You're within within 1 dot of deviation on both the localizer and the glide slope. You're in landing configuration, so for us that's gear down, flaps 40, and you're at an appropriate thrust setting, which we are at right now. And with that, we are completely stabilized, descending through the gate. Again, if you use the fast-slow selector over here, you can fly the airplane a lot more precisely than if you aim to look at the speed gauge. So let's just pause over here and take a moment to talk about our landing. So we're still on autopilot at this time, but we are going to disengage it very, very soon. Now, how do you land the Boeing 707? The 707 is a fairly easy aircraft to land. So maintain the stabilized approach criteria, but from about 200 feet onwards, we don't need to worry about the PAPI or the glide slope any longer. Much rather, we're simply going to look outside and land the airplane. The 707 is not certified for an automatic landing, so latest or lowest 200 is always going to be your minima for a Cat 3 approach. Now, how are we going to fly that final? From 200, you're basically just aiming towards the aiming point on the runway. At 50 feet, you start looking towards the runway end, and the flight engineer is going to do altitude callouts for you based on the radio altimeter. You'll get 50, 30, 20, 10. At 50 feet, you look to the end of the runway, and then use your peripheral vision, which basically means you look at the side of what you recognize while focusing on the front, and that way you kind of see the runway rising on your on the sides of your vision. At 30 feet, flare, idle. Only flare like a degree or two in pitch. It doesn't need any more than that in order to break the rate of descent. And then gently fly the airplane down onto the runway. Don't hold the airplane off from the runway, otherwise you're gonna float into eternity, and simply gently put the airplane down. That's all there is to it. Once you touch down, manually extend the spoilers. You do not have automatic spoilers here. Manually extend the spoilers. Apply maximum reverse. You do also not have auto brakes, so use manual brakes as needed. Personally, I would recommend that you mainly use the spoilers and the reversers to brake while you're at high speeds, and only when you're getting into the lower speeds, so below 100 knots, use manual braking in order to steer the airplane onto the next sensible taxiway. Alright, there's our runway, there's our puppy, we're pretty much straight on, so let's go ahead and take it out of pause, disconnect the autopilot, just maintain your rate of descent here, do not shy away from the runway, maintain everything stable, and only use minimum control inputs. So only do an input when needed. Maintain your rate of descent. Alright, we're nicely on the puppy. Continue. We're below 200, so simply aim for the aiming points.
100.
Look to the runway end. Flare, idle, hold, touchdown. Alright, spoilers, reverse. As you can see, especially at the high speeds, the reversers are doing an awesome job slowing the airplane down. So you don't need any braking at all there. And then below 100 knots we can apply manual brakes to reach an exit as necessary. Passing 80, we are going to stow our reversers, and then below 60 we can turn onto the exits, vacate the runway, get your entire airplane completely off the runway. That's probably most important over here. So here we go. Let's get the entire airplane off the runway, and that mostly means that you make sure that your tailplane is behind whichever line you got towards the end of the runway. So over here, I can't see any line painted, but just make sure that your entire airplane is completely off the runway before you bring the airplane to a stop. Alright, and with that, welcome to Mumbai. So let's go ahead and do the after landing items here. So, for the after landing procedure, exterior lights as needed. So that normally means the landing lights are coming off, the taxi lights remain on, and the strobe light goes off. Then the flaps can be retracted, the speed brake goes all forward, anti-ice as required. So for example, if it's cold outside and there is contamination on the ground, like standing water, then you would put them on, otherwise set it as needed. Probe heat switches off, radar mode selector standby or off, and transponder standby or off. Alright, with that we have done everything we needed to do on the front. Let's just go to the flight engineer here for a moment. We are going to turn the galley power off. We set the paralleling selector towards the external power already, because we'll need that once we reach the gate. For the boost pumps, we turn one on per engine. Like that. And finally, start the APU as needed. Today, we are going to start it, but you wouldn't really need it. Alright. And that's our after landing procedure complete. So, with all of that done, we can now taxi to the gates. Let's get the parking shot out. We've vacated over here. We're now taxiing over here. And our goal is up here, down to those gates, Victor 8. So we're going to turn onto Whiskey 4 when we reach it. That's going to be up front over there. Then a left turn out and in. So, a couple of things to take care of when taxiing in. First of all, the airplane may have warm brakes, depending on how much you use them. That's why I aimed not to use the wheel brakes and rely on the thrust reversers while we've been at a high speed. If the brakes are warm, you will definitely feel that they feel a little bit itchy and the airplane may not decelerate as well as you want it to. You may also hear a sound that sounds a little bit like Chewbacca, and that's basically your indicator that you're overheating the brakes. So the plane talks to you, quite literally. Now, for this, I basically like to keep my brake usage on the runway to a minimum. Remember to use oversteering as necessary, and whenever you are crossing an active runway, remember to turn these strobe lights on, like we are doing right now. The maximum speeds that I'd laid out in the taxi out part of the tutorial are obviously still applicable, so ensure that you have no more than 15 knots on Abrams, 10 knots for turns tighter than 30 degrees, 30 knots on long straight lines, and a maximum of 50 knots when backtracking a runway. Now, as we are leaving the runway, we can turn the strobe lights back off again. And as we're approaching the gate, always remember to start the APU if you intend to use it. If the APU is not intended, today we need it just because of the high outside temperature here. You can see it's 29 degrees outside. If the use of the APU is not intended, then you don't have to start it. Basically up to the pilot. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn into the general direction of the terminal over here. And then our gate is going to be Victor 8, so that's going to be the second gate on that side over there. Let's see if we got some ground services to guide us in. Victor 8. No follow me needed. Handling by Air India. Okay, there's our ground services. So, approaching the parking position, we set the taxi lights and the turn-off lights off. So here's our line for Victor 8. Do the same that you did when you line up on the runway. Wait until you are literally above the line and only then start turning into the gate. That's a pretty good technique. Normally needs about half tiller input in order to align your aircraft with the center line. That way you have a little bit of margin in case you overshoot, but you also have a little bit of margin in case you undershoot. Okay. So then, taxi in nice and slowly. Like this. Alright, and here we are. So the parking brake is set. Let's go ahead and shut our plane down. For that, we're going to jump straight to the engineer's panel. We verify that the parking brake is set. We ensure that the air conditioning units are off, the compressors are all stopped. Then we ensure that the anti-ice is switched off, and then we can set our engine start levers into cutoff. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So, the engine's running down, our ground power is connected, so let's go ahead and put that thing on the bus. And unfortunately, at this point, there is a little bug here. You can see I've selected it on, but nonetheless, we've lost AC power. That's a bug in the version I currently have. Normally, you're still supposed to have full AC power available on your airplane. So let's just imagine that we still had it and continue all the way. So next up, we are going to switch the beacon light off. We are going to set the set the emergency lights as needed. Basically, if a turnaround is planned, we leave them unarmed. Otherwise, we are going to turn them off. We set the seatbelt and no smoking switches off. We set the yaw damper switch off. And then, if chocks are in position, we can release our parking brake. Lastly, now that external power or ground power has established, we could turn the galley power back on if it's required during a turnaround. We switch our fuel pumps all off. You're supposed to be off. So we switch our fuel pumps all off. We switch the AC auxiliary hydraulic pumps off. And we ensure that the temperature control valves are fully closed. Finally, the oxygen regulators are set as needed. If a turnaround is planned, you can leave them on. Otherwise, you are going to switch those off. And that's all there is to this. With that, welcome to Mumbai. That's your first flight on the Boeing 707 completed. As you can see, a little bit of stuff that's going on everywhere. Nothing too complex once you get your head around the airplane. It basically does the same thing that all the newer airplanes does as well. It just looks a little bit more impressive to the chicks. And that's really all there is to this. Now, if you are going to leave the aircraft, there are a couple more things for us to do. So if we do shut it back to cold and dark, then we are going to switch the emergency lights off. Remember, forward is off, depending on the option that you have selected. Then we're also going to switch the APU off and the APU bleed off. And once the APU has completely shut down, so if the RPMs reach 0, that's your moment to turn the battery off. And really only that is your moment to turn the battery off. If you turn the battery off while the APU is still running down, then the APU door is going to stay open and things like birds and stuff may start nesting in your APU inlet, which you really don't want unless you're a fan of Kentucky Fried Chicken next time you're starting the APU. Alright, now it's off, and then we can turn the battery off as well. And that's our flight in the 707 completed. The airplane is back in cold and dark. Well guys, and that's it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked the tutorial. Leave your feedback in the comments underneath the video. Like, comment and subscribe. And if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.